The sunrise painted the Texas hill country in shades of amber and rose, the kind of light that made a man believe in second chances. Frank Morrison knelt in the garden his wife had built, dirt under his fingernails, talking to flowers that couldn't answer back. 16 months had passed since Rose died, and still he set 2 coffee cups on the porch railing every morning. Old habits, people said. Frank called it loyalty. The tomato plants needed staking. Rose would have noticed that 3 weeks ago, would have had the bamboo poles positioned and the vines tied with strips of old t-shirts she saved in a basket by the barn. She noticed everything about this garden, 46 varieties of roses, each one chosen for how it performed in the brutal Texas summer, each one cataloged in the leather journal she kept on the kitchen counter. Frank still opened that journal some mornings, reading her notes in handwriting that slanted left like she was always leaning into the future. March 15. The date meant nothing to most people. To Frank, it marked 16 months of waking up alone in a bed that felt too wide, of cooking breakfast for one while pretending he wasn't, of running a 220-acre ranch with only his mother's voice from the cottage and a bull who remembered Rose better than some people did. He heard the truck before he saw it, Diane's old Chevy, the blue one with the dent in the passenger door from where she'd backed into Rose's mailbox 4 years ago. They'd laughed about that for months, Rose teasing that Diane couldn't park a truck if her life depended on it. The memory sat in Frank's chest like a stone that had grown smooth from handling. Diane Harper climbed out, carrying a thermos and a paper bag that smelled like cinnamon. 58 years old, silver hair cut short because she said life was too brief for styling, widow herself for 5 years now. She'd been Rose's best friend since college, back when they were 2 kids from ranch families who thought they could change the world with biology degrees and stubbornness. She didn't say good morning. They were past that kind of formality. She just poured coffee into the 2 cups Frank had set out, added cream to hers the way she always did, and sat in Rose's chair like she had every Sunday for the past 16 months. "Tomatoes need staking," Diane said aside to see. "I know. Rose would have done it by now." "I know that too." They sat in silence for a while, watching the light shift across the pasture where Ranger grazed. The Highland bull stood 7 feet at the shoulder, 2,400 pounds of rust-colored hair and curved horns, as much a part of Rose's legacy as the garden or the land itself. Diane pulled a cinnamon roll from the bag, broke it in half, handed Frank the larger piece. This was their ritual. Sunday mornings, coffee, and whatever Diane had baked, sitting on the porch where Rose used to read field guides and sketch birds. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. Both were acceptable. "I need to tell you something," Diane said finally. Frank waited. Diane didn't waste words. "I found survey stakes on your east pasture yesterday. Orange plastic, numbered tags. Someone's been marking your property." The coffee went bitter in Frank's mouth. "When?" "Must have been Thursday or Friday. I was checking the fence line by the creek and there they were. 20 of them, running right through Rose's memorial grove." The memorial grove. The stand of oaks where Frank had scattered Rose's ashes on a morning so cold his breath had frozen in the air. Where her favorite bench still sat, weathered wood that needed sanding. Where he went when the silence in the house became too heavy to carry. "County didn't notify me of any surveys," Frank said. "They wouldn't if it's an HOA project. I did some checking. Sheila Patterson filed paperwork 3 weeks ago for a recreational easement survey. She's planning something, Frank, something big." Sheila Patterson. The name alone made Frank's jaw tighten. HOA president of Willow Creek Estates, the subdivision that had sprouted like mushrooms on what used to be the Henderson Ranch. 200 houses, each one worth more than Frank's entire cattle operation. Each one occupied by people who wanted the view of ranch land without the reality of it. Sheila drove a white Tesla Model X with a vanity plate that read Progress. She wore athleisure that cost more than Frank spent on groceries in a month. She spoke in boardroom language about community enhancement and property values, as if the land were nothing more than an asset to be optimized. "What kind of recreational easement?" Frank asked. Diane's expression told him everything before she spoke. "Bike path, 8 feet wide, 2.5 miles long, concrete. It cuts right through 6 properties, but yours is the centerpiece. Goes straight through the memorial grove, crosses the creek in 3 places, bisects Ranger's main pasture." The world tilted slightly. Frank set his coffee cup down carefully, afraid he might drop it. "That's not possible. There's no easement on this land. My grandfather homesteaded here in 1889. We've held clear title for 135 years." Sheila says there's a 1968 recreational easement that gives the community rights to build public infrastructure across private property. She filed it with the county clerk last month. That's a lie. I know it is. Rose would have known about any easement. She researched this land's legal history when she was working on the conservation corridor. There's an emergency access easement from 1952 for fire trucks, but nothing about recreation. Frank stood, walked to the porch railing, gripped the wood until his knuckles went white. Below him, the land rolled away in gentle slopes covered in spring grass. 135 years of Morrison family history. His grandfather had broken this ground with a mule and a plow. His father had strung the first barbed wire, dug the first well, built the barn that still stood solid despite a century of Texas weather. And Rose. Rose had transformed it from a working ranch into something more. She documented every plant species, cataloged the wildlife, mapped the watershed, proved that this land supported an ecosystem worth protecting. She'd been 2 days from finalizing a conservation easement when her heart stopped in the middle of breakfast, coffee cup halfway to her lips, gone before Frank could catch her. "Where is she planning to put this bike path?" Frank asked quietly. Diane pulled a folded paper from her jacket pocket, spread it on the porch table. A survey map, color-coded, with a thick red line snaking across Frank's property. The line went through Rose's garden, through the memorial grove, through the research plots where she'd spent 15 years studying native plants, through the creek crossing where they'd had their first kiss 43 years ago, through everything that mattered. "When?" Frank's voice came out rough. "Construction starts May 1st, 6 weeks from now. She's already hired contractors, ordered materials. The HOA approved funding last week. Special assessment, $600 per household." "On what legal basis?" "The 1968 easement I mentioned. Except I don't think it exists, Frank. I think she forged it." Frank turned to look at her. Diane's face was set in the expression he remembered from college, when she and Rose had fought the university administration over environmental studies funding. Diane taught high school biology for 30 years. She knew how to spot a lie. "Can you prove it?" "Not yet. But Judge Carolyn is looking into it. She used to practice property law before she retired. If anyone can find the original document, it's her." Judge Carolyn Hayes, another one of Rose's circle, another widow fighting her own battles. She'd lost a granddaughter to an HOA's negligence 4 years ago, had retired from the bench to fight HOA corruption full-time. "What does she need from me?" "Time and faith. She's going through county archives, but it's slow work. Meanwhile, Sheila's moving fast. The surveyors will be back Monday to finalize their measurements." A truck door slammed. Frank's son's vehicle, the black Ford that meant Lily was here for her weekend visit. 12 years old now, caught between childhood and something harder, still figuring out if this ranch was part of her future or just a relic of her grandfather's past. She climbed out, backpack over one shoulder, phone in hand like all kids her age. But she looked up when she saw Frank, put the phone away without being asked. Small courtesies that meant everything. "Grandpa," she hugged him, fierce and quick. "Hi, Miss Diane." "Morning, sweetheart. Your grandpa and I were just talking about the garden. Want to help with some planting?" Lily looked at the roses, the tomatoes, the herbs that Rose had arranged in patterns that made sense to her biologist's mind. "Can I learn Grandma's whistle, the one she used for Ranger?" Frank's throat closed. He nodded, not trusting his voice. "Your grandma had a 3-note call," Diane said, demonstrating. A sharp rising tone, a middle note held long, a falling finish. Musical and distinct. She used it to call Ranger in from pasture. He'd come running every time. Lily tried it, got the first note right, fumbled the second. Tried again. On the third attempt, something close to Rose's call echoed across the pasture, and Ranger's massive head lifted, the bull's ears swiveled toward the sound. For a moment, just a moment, the animal stood perfectly still, as if listening for a voice that would never come again. Then he went back to grazing. But something had shifted. Frank saw it in the way Lily's face changed, in the sudden understanding that she was connected to something larger than herself. "He remembers her," Lily whispered. "Animals never forget love," Frank said. "Neither do people." They spent the morning working in the garden. Diane showed Lily how to tie tomato vines, how to identify weeds from seedlings, how to read the soil's moisture by color and texture. Frank staked plants and listened to them talk, grateful for voices that filled the silence Rose had left behind. At noon, they broke for lunch. Sandwiches on the porch, sweet tea in mason jars, the easy rhythm of family that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with choice. That's when they saw the vehicles coming up the county road. 3 trucks, official-looking, with magnetic signs that read Hill Country Survey Services. They turned onto Frank's property without slowing, drove straight to the east pasture like they owned it. Frank set down his sandwich and stood. "Stay here." But Diane was already moving, and Lily followed despite his instruction. They walked together across the yard, past the barn, toward the pasture where strangers were unloading equipment. The surveyors wore reflective vests and carried expensive-looking instruments. 4 men, young enough to be Frank's grandchildren, working with the confidence of people who believed they had authority. The crew chief saw Frank approaching and raised a hand in greeting, as if they were neighbors meeting by chance instead of trespassers caught in the act. "Afternoon, sir. We're just doing some preliminary measurements for the Willow Creek Bike Path project. Shouldn't take more than a couple hours." "This is private property," Frank said quietly. The young man pulled a tablet from his vest, swiped through screens. "We have authorization, sir. HOA infrastructure project properly documented with the county. We have legal right of access." "Show me the document." A flicker of uncertainty crossed the surveyor's face. He swiped again, pulled up a scanned image, held it out. Frank took the tablet, studied the page. Recreational Easement Agreement, dated March 1968, between Morrison Ranch Holdings and Hill Country Municipal Planning Commission. Legal language about public access, community benefit, perpetual rights to construct and maintain recreational infrastructure across designated corridors. It looked official. It sounded official. It was also completely fabricated, Frank was certain. His grandfather would have mentioned something this significant. His father would have fought it. And Rose, meticulous Rose with her legal research and her archived documents, would have found it when she was working on the conservation easement. "This is fake," Frank said. The surveyor's expression hardened. "Sir, that's a certified county document. If you interfere with permitted survey work, you're breaking the law. And if you don't leave my property in the next 60 seconds, you're trespassing." The sound of an engine made them all turn. A white Tesla Model X, gleaming in the afternoon sun, pulled up to the fence line and parked. The driver's door opened and Sheila Patterson emerged like a general inspecting troops. She was 54 years old, carrying her age in the kind of preserved way that required money and discipline. Designer sunglasses despite the clouds, Lululemon from head to toe. An expression that suggested she'd never met a problem she couldn't solve, with the right combination of pressure and paperwork. "Mr. Morrison." Her voice carried across the pasture, pleasant and sharp at the same time. "I see you've met our survey crew. They're doing excellent work. We're very excited about this project." Frank walked toward her, Diane and Lily following. The fence line between them might as well have been a border between countries. "This is private land, Mrs. Patterson. Your people are trespassing." "Oh, Frank." She said his first name like they were friends, like she had earned that intimacy through something other than proximity. "I understand change is difficult, especially for someone your age, but progress requires adaptation. The 1968 easement gives us full legal authority to proceed with community infrastructure development." "There is no 1968 easement. The county clerk's office disagrees. I have the documentation right here." She pulled out her phone, pulled up the same image the surveyor had shown. "See? Properly filed, properly notarized, completely legal." Diane stepped forward. "That document is forged, Sheila. The original 1952 easement was for emergency vehicle access only, fire trucks and ambulances, nothing about recreation." Sheila's smile didn't change, but something cold entered her eyes. "Mrs. Harper, I should have known you'd involve yourself in this. You and Rose always did stick together, but Rose is dead, and this land needs to serve the living. 200 families in Willow Creek Estates deserve safe recreational amenities. Your husband's nostalgia doesn't supersede community needs." The casual cruelty of it hit Frank like a physical blow. Rose's name in Sheila's mouth, reduced to past tense, dismissed as if her years of work meant nothing. Lily's small hand found his. "Grandpa," she whispered. He squeezed her fingers gently, forcing himself to stay calm. "My wife spent 30 years studying this land. She documented 47 species, including endangered salamanders that are protected under state law. Your bike path would destroy their habitat. Oh, please. Sheila waved a hand dismissively. Salamanders can relocate. People can't. This bike path represents health, safety, and property values. It's happening, Mr. Morrison. The only question is whether you accept it gracefully or fight a battle you can't win. She pulled her phone up again, this time switching to video mode, filming him openly. For the record, this is the rancher who's blocking community health initiatives. Selfish, backwards thinking that puts cattle over children. Frank felt Diane's hand on his arm, restraining him. Your wife's been dead for years, darling. Sheila's voice took on a saccharine quality that made Frank's skin crawl. Time to modernize and join the real world. Her gardens, her research, her little projects, they're all very sweet, but they're over. This is about the future now. She turned to the surveyors. Gentlemen, continue your work. Mr. Morrison may bluster, but he won't interfere with legal county operations, will you, Frank? The surveyors looked uncertain, caught between conflicting authorities. Frank could call the sheriff, but that would take time, and by then the measurements would be done. He could physically stop them, but that would make him the aggressor, give Sheila exactly the footage she wanted. Pack up, he said to the crew chief. Now, before I call my attorney. Your attorney? Sheila laughed, a brittle sound. Frank, you're a rancher on a fixed income. You can't afford the kind of legal representation you'd need to fight this. I have a Houston firm on retainer. They eat men like you for breakfast. Then they'll choke on me, oh. Sheila's expression shifted, something dangerous flickering behind the polished facade. You really want to do this the hard way? Fine. Construction starts May 1st, whether you like it or not. I have permits, I have funding, I have legal authority, and I have something else. She leaned closer to the fence, close enough that Frank could smell her expensive perfume. I have time. You're what, 65? How many years do you have left to fight? How long before you're too old, too tired, too broken to stand in the way? As long as it takes. She studied him for a moment, then smiled. We'll see. Enjoy your garden, Frank, while you still can. She walked back to her Tesla, unhurried, confident. The surveyors packed their equipment, loaded the trucks, drove away with apologetic glances that meant nothing. The Tesla's engine made no sound, but Frank heard the door close, saw Sheila sit for a moment checking her phone before driving away. When the dust settled, Diane turned to him. That document she showed you? It's fake, Frank. I'm certain of it. How do you know? Because I helped Rose research the legal history of this property when she was working on the conservation easement. We went through every deed, every filing, every scrap of paper in the county archives. There was no recreational easement in 1968, just the emergency access from 52. Can you prove it? That's what Judge Carolyn is working on. She's trying to find the original 52 document to show what it actually says. But, Frank, there's something else. Diane pulled out her phone, pulled up a photo of the survey map. Look at this line. Look where the bike path goes. Frank studied the red line. It wasn't random. It didn't follow the easiest route or the most logical path. It went deliberately through every place that had mattered to Rose. The garden, the memorial grove, the research plots, the creek crossings she'd mapped, the bench where she used to sit and write in her journals. This isn't about a bike path, Frank said slowly. No, I don't think it is. They walked back to the house in silence, Lily between them, holding both their hands. Frank's mind raced through possibilities, through strategies, through the legal and practical realities of fighting someone like Sheila Patterson. At the porch, Diane stopped. There's a quilting circle meeting Thursday night at my place. I think you should let us help. This isn't your fight, Diane. The hell it isn't. Rose was my best friend for 40 years. This land holds her memory. That makes it my fight, too. And there are 14 other women in that circle who feel the same way. Frank started to protest, but Lily squeezed his hand. Let them help, Grandpa. You can't do everything alone. She sounded so much like Rose in that moment that Frank's chest tightened. Rose had never been afraid to ask for help, had built networks and coalitions and communities wherever she went. She'd understood something Frank was only beginning to learn in her absence. Strength wasn't about standing alone. It was about knowing when to let others stand with you. Okay, he said, Thursday night. What do I need to bring? Diane smiled. Just yourself, and maybe some of Rose's field journals. I have a feeling we're going to need them. After Diane left, Frank walked out to the memorial grove with Lily. The oak trees stood quiet in the afternoon light, their branches creating patterns of shadow that shifted with the breeze. Somewhere in the grass beneath them, Rose's ashes had long since returned to the soil, becoming part of the land she'd loved. Frank showed Lily the bench, showed her where the survey stakes had been planted, explained what the bike path would destroy. "Why does she hate you?" Lily asked. "I don't think she hates me, honey. I think she sees me as an obstacle, someone standing between her and what she wants." "But what does she want? It's just a bike path." Frank sat on the bench, and Lily settled beside him. "I'm not sure yet, but your grandmother taught me something. When people fight this hard for something small, they're usually hiding something bigger." "What would Grandma do?" The question hit him harder than any of Sheila's insults. What would Rose do? She'd research, she'd organize, she'd find allies and build coalitions, and fight with facts and fellowship instead of anger. She'd finish what she started, Frank said, the conservation easement she was working on when she died. That would protect this land permanently. No bike paths, no development, just preservation. "Can you do that?" "I don't know. She'd been working with Judge Carolyn and some of the neighboring ranchers, but the paperwork wasn't finished. I'm not even sure where all the pieces are." Lily pulled out her phone, opened the Notes app. "Then we find them, make a list. What did Grandma need to finish the easement?" Frank looked at his granddaughter, this child who'd spent more time on screens than soil, who was choosing to help instead of hiding in her own world. Something shifted in him, some wall he'd built around his grief beginning to crack. Signatures from the 6 neighboring ranchers, environmental impact assessment, county approval, legal description of the protected area, and a conservation organization willing to hold the easement in perpetuity. Lily typed as he spoke. What did she finish before she died? The environmental assessment. She'd spent 15 years documenting everything. And she had commitments from 4 of the 6 ranchers. Just needed 2 more signatures. So we get them, we finish what Grandma started. It's not that simple, honey. Why not? If the land needs protecting, and she did the hard work, why can't we finish it? Frank didn't have a good answer for that. Rose would have finished it months ago if she'd been here. She wouldn't have let grief or uncertainty stop her. She'd have marshaled her forces, organized her people, pushed forward with the kind of determined grace that made impossible things happen. They walked back to the house as the sun started its descent. Frank made dinner, simple food that Rose would have improved with herbs from the garden. Lily set the table without being asked, put out 3 plates before catching herself, returning one to the cabinet with careful hands. After she went to bed, Frank sat on the porch with Rose's field journals, reading her notes by lamplight. Her handwriting covered page after page, observations about seasonal changes, species counts, watershed measurements. 47 species she'd written, 12 of them rare or threatened, 3 found nowhere else in Texas Hill Country. This land is irreplaceable. On the last page, dated 2 days before she died, she'd written, "Conservation easement nearly complete." Frank doesn't understand yet how important this is. But he will. The land will teach him, the way it taught me. We don't own it, we're just temporary stewards. Our job is to pass it forward intact. Frank closed the journal, set it carefully on the table beside him. The night was quiet except for distant cattle and the wind in the oaks. Somewhere out there, Ranger bedded down in the pasture he'd claimed as his own, the same pasture Sheila wanted to cut in half with concrete. His phone buzzed. A text from Diane. "Judge Carolyn found something. She wants to meet tomorrow, 9 a.m. at her office. Bring Rose's easement research if you have it." Frank texted back, "I'll be there." He sat for a while longer, talking to Rose the way he did most nights when the house got too quiet. "I don't know how to do this without you, Rosie. You were the organizer. You knew how to bring people together, how to make them care about things bigger than themselves. I'm just a rancher. I know cattle and grass and when to move the herd. This legal stuff, this community organizing, it's your territory." The wind moved through the oaks, and Frank pretended it was an answer. "But I'll try. For you. For this land. For Lily. So she has something to inherit that's not just dirt and debt. I'll try." He went inside, washed the coffee cup, set 2 out for morning by habit. In the bedroom, he looked at Rose's side of the closet, still full of her clothes. He hadn't been able to clear it, couldn't face the finality of that particular task. On her nightstand, the last book she'd been reading, a field guide to native Texas plants, bookmarked 3/4 through. Frank picked it up, opened to the marked page. She'd highlighted a passage about restoration ecology. The land remembers what we forget. Seeds can lie dormant for decades, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. What looks dead is often just sleeping. Our job is to create the conditions for revival. Frank set the book down carefully, climbed into bed on his side, left hers empty. Sleep came slowly, the way it always did now, his mind circling through problems he couldn't solve alone. But tomorrow, Diane had said, tomorrow Judge Carolyn had found something. Tomorrow they'd start building the case, assembling the evidence, organizing the resistance. Tomorrow he'd begin to fight for what Rose had died trying to protect. He fell asleep with her journals on the nightstand, and dawn already planning its arrival. Thursday arrived with the kind of clarity that made every fence post visible for miles. Frank drove to Judge Carolyn Hayes's office, a converted Victorian house on the edge of town that she'd bought after retiring from the bench. Rose's field journals and easement research filled a box in his passenger seat. Diane was already there, along with Judge Carolyn and another woman Frank didn't recognize. Mid-40s, professional bearing, eyes that missed nothing. "Frank Morrison, this is Bonnie Mitchell," Judge Carolyn said. "She's a nurse, lives in Willow Creek Estates, and she's been documenting Sheila Patterson's behavior for the past year." Bonnie shook his hand firmly. "Mr. Morrison, I'm sorry for what you're going through. Sheila's been terrorizing anyone who questions her decisions. I've watched her bully elderly residents, threaten people with foreclosure, manipulate HOA funds. Someone needs to stop her." They settled around Judge Carolyn's conference table, and she spread out documents like a general planning a campaign. "I found the original 1952 easement," she said. "Took 3 days of digging through county archives, but I found it." She laid out a yellow document, carefully preserved in a protective sleeve. Frank leaned forward to read it. "Emergency Vehicle Access Easement, dated June 1952, granting Hill County Fire Department and Emergency Services right of ingress and egress across Morrison Ranch property in the event of fire or medical emergency. Limited to vehicles responding to active emergencies. No permanent structures permitted. No public recreational use authorized." "There's nothing in here about bike paths," Frank said. "Exactly. Now look at this." Judge Carolyn laid Sheila's version beside the original. Same header, same date, but look at the language. Sheila's version includes addendums about recreational infrastructure, community enhancement, perpetual public access. None of that appears in the original. Diane pulled out a magnifying glass, examined both documents closely. "The typewriter font is wrong. The original uses a Remington standard from the early 50s. You can tell by the serifs on the capital T and the spacing of the lowercase e. Sheila's version uses Times New Roman, which wasn't invented until 1931 and wasn't widely available until computer typesetting in the 80s, Judge Carolyn added. "This is a forgery, and not even a good one. Sheila was counting on no one checking the archives." "Can we use this to stop her?" Frank asked. "Absolutely. I'm filing an injunction this afternoon, emergency hearing tomorrow morning. With this evidence, any judge will halt construction until the easement question is resolved properly." Relief washed through Frank so strong it left him lightheaded. "Thank you, all of you." "Don't thank us yet," Bonnie said. "Sheila doesn't back down easily. When the injunction hits, she's going to escalate." "How do you know?" "Because I've seen her do it before. Last year, a resident questioned her budget numbers at a meeting. She hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on him, spread rumors about his marriage, made his life hell until he moved away. She's vindictive, Mr. Morrison. You need to be prepared." "For what?" "For her to make this personal." Judge Carolyn gathered the documents carefully. "In the meantime, we should talk about Rose's conservation easement. If we can finalize that, it creates an additional layer of protection. Even if Sheila somehow overcomes the forgery evidence, she can't build through a registered conservation corridor." Frank opened the box he'd brought, pulled out Rose's research. She had environmental assessments, species documentation, watershed maps, and commitments from 4 neighboring ranchers to join the easement. "Which ranchers?" "The Kowalskis, the Chens, the Hendersons, and the Blackwells. She needed the Thompsons and the Rodriguezes to make it work, but she died before she could approach them." "I know Bill Thompson," Diane said. "He and his wife Patricia were at Rose's funeral. They'd sign if we asked." "And Maria Rodriguez is in the quilting circle," Judge Carolyn added. Her husband Carlos would follow her lead. The pieces were falling into place, the network Rose had built still intact even in her absence. Frank felt something shift in his chest, some frozen part of his grief beginning to thaw. "We could finish it," he said quietly. "Actually finish what she started." "We could," Judge Carolyn agreed, "but it takes time. Filing, review, approval. Probably 4 to 6 months if everything goes smoothly. And Sheila's construction starts in 6 weeks. Which is why we need both strategies. The injunction stops her immediately. The conservation easement protects the land permanently." They spent the next 2 hours working through details. Judge Carolyn would file the injunction and prepare the conservation easement paperwork. Diane would approach the remaining ranchers. Bonnie would continue documenting Sheila's activities from inside Willow Creek. And Frank would gather any additional research Rose had left behind. That evening, Frank drove to Diane's house for the Quilting Circle meeting. 15 women gathered in her living room, ages ranging from 45 to 78. They sat around a frame where a quilt was taking shape. Each square a different pattern, different colors, different memories. "This was Rose's memorial quilt," Diane explained. Each woman had contributed a square representing something they remembered about Rose. Together, the squares created something larger than any individual piece. Frank's mother Grace was there, 78 years old and sharp as the needles she wielded. She taught Rose to garden when Frank first brought her home, had treated her daughter-in-law like the daughter she'd never had. "Frankie," Grace stood slowly, arthritis making her joints stiff. "Good of you to come. Diane said you ladies might be able to help." "Help?" Grace smiled. "Son, we're going to win this thing. Sit down and let me tell you how." For the next hour, the quilting circle transformed into a strategic planning session. Each woman had a role, connections, skills that could be deployed. Grace would contact the old ranching families, the ones who'd been here for generations, rally them around the conservation easement. Maria Rodriguez would work the Hispanic community, many of whom worked in agriculture and understood land preservation. Judge Carolyn would handle legal strategy. Bonnie would gather evidence from inside Willow Creek. And Diane would coordinate everything, the way Rose used to, bringing the pieces together into a coherent whole. "This is women's work," Grace said. "Not because men can't do it, but because we do it differently. Men fight with force. We fight with networks. Men compete. We collaborate. Sheila Patterson thinks she can steamroll over you because she sees you as one man standing alone. She doesn't see the 15 of us standing behind you." 16, a voice said from the doorway. Lily stood there, having ridden her bike to Diane's house despite the gathering dark. She held up her phone. "I made a TikTok about Grandma's garden. It got 400,000 views. People want to help." The room went quiet. Frank stared at his granddaughter, this child who was bridging generations with technology he barely understood. "What did you make?" Diane asked gently. Lily pulled up the video, hit play. It showed Ranger in the pasture, showed Rose's garden, showed the memorial grove. Lily's voice narrated, "My grandma Rose died 16 months ago. She spent 30 years making this land beautiful and protecting it. Now someone wants to pave it with concrete. Please help us save Grandma's garden." The video was simple, heartfelt, devastating. Comments scrolled beneath it, thousands of them, from people across the country offering support, advice, outrage. "Honey," Frank said, his voice rough. "Thank you." Lily looked at the quilting circle, at all these women who'd loved Rose, who were fighting for her memory. "Can I make a square for the quilt?" Diane's eyes filled. "Of course you can, sweetheart. What would you make?" "Ranger with Grandma, from the photo where she's feeding him an apple." "Perfect." They worked late into the night. Frank sat among the quilters, feeling out of place and completely at home simultaneously. These women had been Rose's people, and now they were his, bound together by memory and purpose. When he finally drove home, stars filled the sky in quantities the city never saw. He parked by the barn, walked out to the pasture where Ranger stood silhouetted against the moonlight. The bull approached at Frank's whistle, big head lowering to accept a scratch between the horns. 7 years old, in his prime, 2,400 pounds of loyalty and muscle. Rose had saved this animal from freezing to death as a calf, had bottle-fed him in the kitchen while Frank protested it was dangerous, had proven that kindness could tame wildness. "You miss her too, don't you, boy?" Ranger made a low sound, not quite a bellow, not quite contentment. The sound of an animal that remembered. "Sheila Patterson wants to put a road through your pasture, wants to destroy what Rose built. We're not going to let her. You hear me? We're going to protect this place." The bull's ear swiveled, listening. "Tomorrow, Judge Carolyn files the injunction. Tomorrow, we start fighting back. And if it comes down to it, if Sheila tries to force her way through with bulldozers and concrete, I need you to do what you do best. Protect your home." Frank didn't know if bulls understood complex speech, but Ranger had lived with Rose long enough to understand tone, intention, love. The bull nuzzled Frank's shoulder gently, a gesture of trust. Walking back to the house, Frank's phone buzzed. A text from Bonnie. "You need to see this. Check Willow Creek HOA Facebook group." Frank opened the app, navigated to the group page. Sheila had posted a video, professionally edited, showing Frank's property from aerial drone footage. The narration talked about selfish ranchers blocking community progress, about outdated thinking preventing modern amenities, about how one man's nostalgia shouldn't override 200 families' needs. The comments were divided. Some supported Sheila, calling Frank everything from backwards to dangerous. Others defended him, pointing out property rights and legal concerns. The debate raged across hundreds of comments, turning neighbors against neighbors. Frank closed the app. Tomorrow would bring the injunction, would force Sheila to pause, would give them time to mount a real defense. But Bonnie was right. This was personal now. Sheila wasn't just fighting for a bike path. She was fighting to prove something, to win something, to demonstrate power over someone who dared stand in her way. Inside, Frank set out 2 coffee cups for morning, a ritual he couldn't break. He opened Rose's final journal, read the last entry again. "The land doesn't need us, we need the land. Our job is to be worthy of it." "I'm trying, Rosie," he said to the empty kitchen. "I'm trying to be worthy." Outside, the hill country night settled over the ranch. In the memorial grove, oak trees stood guard over soil that held Rose's ashes. In the pasture, Ranger grazed under stars. In her cottage, Grace slept with windows open to catch the breeze. And somewhere across the valley, in a house worth more than most people earned in a lifetime, Sheila Patterson plotted her next move. But Frank wasn't alone anymore. He had the quilting circle, had Judge Carolyn's legal expertise, had Bonnie's insider knowledge, had Lily's social media reach, had his mother's strategic mind. He had Rose's research, Rose's network, Rose's vision of what this land could be. And he had Ranger, 7 years of loyalty and muscle, trained by Rose to protect what mattered. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. But tonight, Frank slept better than he had in 16 months, knowing that the work of defending Rose's legacy wasn't his burden alone. The land would teach him, she'd written, and it was starting to. Friday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that made lies visible. Frank drove to Judge Carolyn Hayes' office through streets that still remembered when this town was smaller, quieter, less crowded with people who thought progress meant paving over history. The box of Rose's research sat in the passenger seat like a co-pilot, her handwriting on the labels a reminder that some battles outlive the people who started them. Judge Carolyn's office occupied a converted Victorian on the edge of the historic district, white paint and dark shutters, a wraparound porch where clients could sit and pretend their legal problems might solve themselves through architecture alone. Frank had been here twice before, both times with Rose, both times fighting developers who thought ranch land was just real estate waiting to be optimized. Diane's truck was already there, and another vehicle Frank didn't recognize. He climbed the porch steps, knocked once, entered when Carolyn's voice called out. The interior smelled like old books and fresh coffee, walls lined with law volumes that predated computers, a massive oak desk that had probably witnessed 100 years of contracts and disputes and quiet acts of justice. Carolyn sat behind it, 62 years old, with steel gray hair cut precisely at her shoulders, and eyes that had spent 3 decades on the bench learning to spot lies. "Frank," she stood, shook his hand with a grip that meant business. "Thank you for coming. I think we found something significant." Diane was there, and another woman Frank vaguely recognized from around town. Younger, maybe early 50s, with the kind of exhausted competence that marked nurses and teachers, and anyone who spent their days solving other people's emergencies. "This is Bonnie Mitchell," Carolyn said. "She lives in Willow Creek Estates, registered nurse at Hill Country Medical, and she's been documenting Sheila Patterson's activities for the past 14 months. Bonnie extended her hand. Mr. Morrison, I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. Your wife came to the hospital once when my daughter broke her arm. She sat with us for 2 hours, just keeping Sarah calm, telling her stories about ranch animals. I never forgot that kindness. The memory hit Frank sideways. Rose had done things like that, had possessed an uncanny ability to show up exactly when people needed her, to offer comfort without expecting recognition. He'd found notes after she died, thank you cards from people he'd never met, evidence of a life lived in quiet service to a community he was only now beginning to understand. Rose was good at being present, Frank said. She was, and now Sheila Patterson is trying to erase her legacy. I can't let that happen without a fight. They settled around Carolyn's conference table, and she spread documents with the precision of someone laying evidence before a jury. The morning light caught dust motes in the air, made the old paper look ancient and fragile and permanent all at once. I spent 3 days in the county archives, Carolyn began, going through every filing from 1945 to 1975, looking for anything related to easements, rights-of-way, public access across private property. She laid out a document protected in a clear sleeve. This is the original 1952 emergency vehicle access easement, signed by Frank's grandfather, witnessed by the county clerk, notarized by James Henderson, who was the only notary public within 50 miles back then. Frank leaned forward to read. The paper had yellowed with age, the typing slightly uneven in the way of manual typewriters that required human pressure and imperfect rhythm. But the words were clear. Emergency vehicle access easement, granted to Hill County Fire Department and Emergency Medical Services, limited to vehicular ingress and egress during active emergency response. No permanent structures permitted. No public recreational use authorized. Easement width not to exceed 20 feet. Easement to terminate upon availability of alternate emergency access routes. There's nothing in here about bike paths, Frank said. Nothing at all. Now look at this. Carolyn laid Sheila's version beside it. Same header, same date, but the language had been altered. Sheila's version included paragraphs about recreational infrastructure, community enhancement, perpetual public access regardless of emergency status. Diane pulled a magnifying glass from her bag, the kind librarians used for examining old texts, and studied both documents with the focus of someone who'd spent 40 years teaching teenagers to spot plagiarism. The typewriter font is different, she said after a moment. The original uses a Remington standard from the early 50s. You can identify it by the serifs on the uppercase letters and the distinctive spacing of the lowercase e and a. Sheila's version uses Times New Roman. Carolyn nodded, which wasn't invented until 1931 and wasn't available on typewriters until much later. It became standard with computer word processing in the 80s. Someone created this forgery on a computer, printed it on aged paper, and hoped no one would check the archives. Can we prove it's a forgery in court? Frank asked. Absolutely. I'm filing for an emergency injunction this afternoon. With this evidence, any judge will halt construction pending a full hearing on the easement's validity. Relief flooded through Frank so suddenly he had to grip the edge of the table. For 3 days, he'd been carrying the weight of this fight alone, the certainty that Sheila would steamroll over him because lacked the resources to mount a proper defense. Now, sitting in this Victorian office with these women who'd known Rose, who remembered her kindness and wanted to honor it, he felt something shift. How long before we get a hearing? He asked. Emergency motions move fast. I expect we'll be in front of a judge by Monday morning at the latest. And if the judge sides with us? Then all construction stops immediately. Sheila will have to prove the easement is legitimate, which she can't do because it isn't. The burden of proof shifts to her. Bonnie spoke up, her voice carrying the kind of careful weight that came from delivering bad news to families in hospital waiting rooms. Mr. Morrison, you need to understand something. Sheila doesn't take losses well. When the injunction hits, she's going to escalate. Escalate how? Last year, a resident named Tom Bradley questioned her budget numbers at an HOA meeting, pointed out some discrepancies in how community funds were being allocated. Nothing aggressive, just asking for transparency. Bonnie pulled out her phone, pulled up a series of screenshots. Within a week, Sheila had hired a private investigator. They dug up everything about Tom's life, a DUI from 15 years ago, a messy divorce, some credit card debt. She spread it all over the HOA Facebook group, framed him as financially irresponsible and morally questionable. Made his life so miserable he moved to Colorado. Frank studied the screenshots. The cruelty was casual, efficient, designed to destroy reputations with the kind of precision that came from practice. She's done this before? 3 times that I know of. She can't tolerate anyone challenging her authority. And Mr. Morrison, you're not just challenging her. You're blocking a project she's been planning for 18 months. She'll come after you hard. Let her come. I'm not Tom Bradley. I'm not hiding anything. I'm a 65-year-old rancher who loved his wife and wants to protect her legacy. What can Sheila possibly dig up that would matter? Bonnie exchanged glances with Carolyn and Diane. She'll make things up if she can't find them. She'll twist your grief into mental instability. She'll paint you as a backwards old man standing in the way of community health and safety. And she has resources. Money, connections, a Houston law firm on retainer. I have something better, Frank said quietly. I have the truth. And I have all of you. Diane reached across the table, squeezed his hand. We're not going anywhere, Frank. This is Rose's fight. That makes it ours, too. They spent the next hour reviewing strategy. Carolyn would file the injunction that afternoon, prepare for Monday's hearing, begin the process of getting the forged easement officially voided. Diane would continue working on Rose's conservation easement, approaching the 2 remaining ranchers they needed for signatures. And Bonnie would keep monitoring Sheila from inside Willow Creek, documenting any retaliatory actions. When the meeting broke up, Frank drove home through hills that rolled away in shades of spring green, past cattle grazing on grass that had fed Morrison herds for 135 years. The land looked the same as it always had, but Frank saw it differently now, saw it the way Rose must have seen it, as something precious and temporary and worth fighting for. At the ranch, he found Lily in Rose's garden, on her knees in the dirt, planting something. She looked up when his truck door closed, dirt smudged on her cheek, Rose's old gardening gloves swallowing her small hands. Grandpa, I'm planting tomatoes, the way Grandma's journal said to do it. Frank knelt beside her, looked at the neat row of seedlings she'd positioned with careful spacing. You read her journals? Miss Diane gave me the garden one. It has instructions for everything. When to plant, how deep, how much water. Grandma was really organized. She was. Do you think the bike path will really happen, even with Judge Carolyn helping? Frank watched his granddaughter's face, saw the fear there, the same fear he'd been carrying for days. I think we're going to fight it with everything we have, and I think we might actually win. What if we don't? Then we'll have tried. And trying matters, even when winning isn't guaranteed. Lily went back to her planting, small hands moving dirt with a competence that surprised him. When had she learned to do this? When had this child who lived on her phone and seemed disconnected from anything that didn't involve screens decided that dirt and tomatoes mattered? Grandma's garden can't die, Lily said quietly. It's all I have left of her. The words broke something in Frank's chest. He'd been so focused on the land, on the legal battle, on defending Rose's environmental work, that he'd forgotten the most important thing. This garden wasn't just habitat. It was memory. It was the place where a 12-year-old could feel connected to a grandmother she'd barely had time to know. We're not going to let it die, honey. I promise. That afternoon, Frank's phone started buzzing with notifications. He'd avoided social media for most of his life, considered it a waste of time better spent on actual work. But Lily had insisted he download Facebook so he could monitor the Willow Creek HOA group. Now he understood why. Sheila had posted a new video. Professional quality, drone footage of Frank's ranch from above, sweeping shots that made his property look vast and empty and underutilized. Her voice narrated over images of the memorial grove, the pastures, the creek. This is 220 acres of prime hill country land, held by one man for his private use, while 200 families in our community are denied access to safe recreational amenities. This is the face of selfish individualism, of backwards thinking, that puts personal nostalgia over community welfare. Frank Morrison's refusal to allow a simple bike path isn't about property rights. It's about control. It's about an aging man who can't accept that the world has moved on. The video continued, showing Frank's barn, his cattle, even Ranger in the pasture, all framed to look neglected or dangerous. Sheila's voice took on a tone of concerned reasonableness. Mr. Morrison talks to his deceased wife's ghost. He sets places at his table for a woman who's been gone 16 months. Neighbors have expressed concern about his mental state, his ability to make rational decisions about land use. Perhaps it's time to ask whether one unstable individual should have the power to block progress that benefits hundreds. The comments section exploded. Hundreds of responses, some defending Frank, more attacking him. People he'd never met calling him selfish, crazy, a dinosaur blocking the future. Others pointing out property rights, questioning Sheila's motives, demanding to see the actual easement document. The debate raged across screens in houses all over the county, turning neighbors into opponents, making a simple question of land use into a referendum on values and vision, and whose version of progress deserved to win. Frank closed the app, set his phone down on the kitchen counter, stared at the 2 coffee cups he'd set out that morning by habit. Sheila was right about one thing. He did talk to Rose. He did set her place at the table. He did carry on conversations with someone who couldn't answer. Was that mental instability? Or was it love refusing to accept the finality of loss? His phone rang, Diane's number. "I saw the video," she said without preamble. "It's garbage, Frank. Manipulative garbage designed to make you look unstable." "Maybe I'm unstable, maybe she's right." "Stop! Rose talked to her roses. I still say goodnight to James's photo every evening. Grace keeps your father's coffee mug on the counter 20 years after he died." Grief doesn't follow rules, and anyone who thinks it does has never lost someone who mattered. Frank's throat tightened. "She's winning, Diane. Look at those comments. People believe her. Some people do, others don't. And tomorrow, when Carolyn files that injunction with evidence of forgery, Sheila's credibility collapses. This video is desperation. She knows we're coming for her, and she's trying to poison public opinion before we expose her fraud. How do I fight this? I'm not good at social media wars. I'm a rancher. You don't fight it. We do. The quilting circle meets tonight. Emergency session. We're going to craft a response that makes Sheila regret she ever posted that video. That evening, 15 women gathered in Diane's living room around Rose's memorial quilt. Each square was nearly complete now, each piece of fabric telling a story about a woman who'd touched more lives than Frank had realized. Grace's square showed Rose's prized tomatoes. Maria Rodriguez's showed the roses she'd cultivated. Bonnie's showed Rose teaching first aid to children at the community center. The quilt was becoming a testimony, proof that Rose had built something larger than gardens or research or conservation easements. She'd built community, and that community was still here, still fighting for what she'd loved. Grace spoke first, her 78 years sitting light on shoulders that had carried 4 children through ranching's lean years. That video Sheila posted is character assassination. We need to respond, but not with anger, with facts. Bonnie pulled out her laptop. "I've been documenting Sheila's HOA activities for 14 months. Financial irregularities, harassment of residents, violations of HOA bylaws. I have emails, recordings from meetings, budget documents that don't add up." "Can you prove financial misconduct?" Carolyn asked. "Yeah, not yet. But there are patterns, large payments to vendors I can't verify, expenses that seem inflated. If someone with forensic accounting skills looked at the books, I think they'd find problems." Maria Rodriguez raised her hand. "My daughter-in-law is a CPA. She does fraud investigations for corporate clients. I could ask her to look." Carolyn nodded. "Do it. And Bonnie, keep documenting. If Sheila's embezzling HOA funds, that's criminal, not just civil. It changes everything." They moved through the evening with the efficiency of women who'd organized bake sales and school fundraisers and community events for decades. Each one had a task, a specialty, a piece of the larger strategy. Diane would draft a response to Sheila's video, factual and calm, focusing on property rights and environmental protection. Maria would get her daughter-in-law to examine HOA finances. Grace would contact old ranching families, building support for the conservation easement. And the younger women in the circle would manage social media, countering Sheila's narrative with Frank's actual story. Lily sat in the corner, working on her quilt square, occasionally contributing ideas that made the older women smile. She'd grown up with social media, understood its rhythms and psychology in ways Frank's generation never would. "You need another TikTok," Lily said during a lull in planning. But not angry, sad, show Grandma's garden, show Grandpa working in it. Let people see what would be destroyed. Can you make that? Diane asked. Already planning it. I'll film this weekend. We need golden hour light for maximum emotional impact. Grace laughed. Lord, this child speaks a language I don't understand, but if it helps Frank, I'm all for it. The meeting ran late, strategy becoming conversation, becoming the kind of fellowship that held communities together when circumstances tried to tear them apart. Frank sat among these women and felt Rose's presence so strongly it hurt. She would have loved this, would have been at the center of it, organizing and encouraging, and finding ways to turn individual strengths into collective power. When he finally drove home, stars filled the sky in quantities that reminded him why he stayed here, why he fought to protect land that most people saw as empty space waiting to be filled. The darkness wasn't empty. It was full of things that mattered more than convenience or property values or bike paths. Sunday morning brought Grace to Frank's porch, walking carefully with the cane she'd started using last year, but pretending she didn't need. She carried a newspaper, the local weekly that still printed actual news instead of just reprinting internet stories. You need to see this, she said, handing it to him. The editorial section featured a letter to the editor, Grace's letter. Frank read it standing on the porch while his mother watched with an expression that dared him to object. To the editor, I have lived in hill country for 56 years. I raised 4 children on ranch land that has been in our family since 1889. I have seen developers come and go, have watched farmland become subdivisions, have witnessed the slow transformation of working ranches into bedroom communities for people who want the view without the life. My daughter-in-law, Rose Morrison, spent 30 years studying the land my son Frank now protects. She documented species, mapped watersheds, proved that this acreage supports an ecosystem found nowhere else in Texas. She died before she could finish establishing a conservation easement that would protect not just our ranch, but 6 neighboring properties. Now Sheila Patterson, HOA president of Willow Creek Estates, claims my son is mentally unstable because he grieves his wife. She says he talks to Rose's memory, sets places at his table, refuses to let go of the past. I have news for Mrs. Patterson. My son talks to his late wife because he loved her. That's not mental illness. That's loyalty. And if maintaining bonds with the dead makes someone unstable, then I am unstable too. I talk to my husband every morning 20 years after his death. I keep his tools in the barn, his hat on the hook by the door, his favorite coffee mug on the counter. Sheila Patterson talks to her Tesla's computer. Which one of us is crazy? My son is not blocking progress. He is protecting irreplaceable habitat so that his granddaughter and her children might inherit something more valuable than concrete. That's not backwards thinking. That's wisdom. If Willow Creek residents want a bike path, they can build it on their own property. They can route it around ranches instead of through them. They can ask permission instead of forging documents. Or they can keep attacking a good man who just lost his wife and see how that works out for them. Grace Morrison, lifelong hill country resident, mother of Frank Morrison, friend of truth. Frank lowered the paper. Ma, you're going to make Sheila furious. Good. Fury makes people careless. Careless people make mistakes. Grace settled into Rose's chair, accepted the coffee Frank poured. Your father used to say, when someone attacks you personally, it means they can't attack your position. Sheila's video wasn't about the bike path. It was about destroying your credibility because she knows the easement is fake. Carolyn files the injunction tomorrow. I know. And when that happens, Sheila is going to come unglued. We need to be ready. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunrise paint the hills. Somewhere in the pasture, Ranger was waking up, beginning his day of grazing and watching and protecting territory he considered his own. The bull had been restless lately, Frank noticed, more alert, more focused on the fence line where Sheila's surveyors had appeared. Animals knew when their home was threatened. Ranger was no exception. Monday morning arrived with the weight of consequence. Frank dressed carefully, put on the sport coat he'd worn to Rose's funeral, drove to the county courthouse where Carolyn had scheduled the emergency hearing. Diane met him in the parking lot, and together they climbed the marble steps that had witnessed a century of Texas justice. The courtroom was smaller than Frank expected, wood paneling and fluorescent lights, and an American flag standing beside the judge's bench. Sheila was already there with her attorney, a Houston lawyer whose suit probably cost more than Frank spent on groceries in a year. Judge Patricia Thornton entered, 70 years old with white hair and eyes that had seen every trick lawyers could pull. She settled behind the bench, reviewed the filings, looked up at both parties. This is an emergency motion for temporary restraining order filed by Judge Carolyn Hayes on behalf of Frank Morrison. Mrs. Patterson, you're represented by counsel. Sheila's attorney stood. Marcus Webb, Your Honor, representing Willow Creek Estates HOA. We oppose this motion. The bike path project has been properly permitted, properly funded, and is based on a legitimate 1968 recreational easement. Carolyn rose. Your Honor, that easement is a forgery. I have the original 1952 document from county archives. The language is completely different from what Mrs. Patterson filed last month. She approached the bench, handed up both documents in their protective sleeves. Judge Thornton studied them with the kind of careful attention that made lawyers nervous. This original is the emergency vehicle access easement? Yes, Your Honor. Note the limited scope. Emergency vehicles only. No mention of recreational use. No authorization for permanent structures. And this second document? A forgery created on a computer using Times New Roman font, which didn't exist in 1968. The paper has been artificially aged, the notary signature is incorrect, and the legal language includes terminology that wasn't in common use until the 1990s. Sheila's attorney interjected. Your Honor, these are serious accusations without foundation. My client relied on documentation provided by the county clerk's office. Which office? Judge Thornton asked sharply. The current clerk, Margaret Chen. Who happens to be Mrs. Patterson's personal friend and bunco partner, Carolyn added. Your Honor, the original easement has been in county archives since 1952. It was never misfiled. Someone created a forgery and convinced Clerk Chen to accept it without verifying against the original. Judge Thornton's expression could have frozen water. Mr. Webb, does your client have any evidence that this 1968 document is legitimate? Marcus Webb shuffled papers, looking increasingly uncomfortable. We have the document filed with the county, which is a forgery, according to opposing counsel's forensic analysis. Do you have the original? Do you have any chain of custody documentation, any evidence beyond the document itself? Sheila stood up, interrupting her own attorney. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. That rancher is blocking community health and safety for selfish reasons. We have 200 families who deserve recreational amenities. His refusal to cooperate is unreasonable. Mrs. Patterson, sit down. Your attorney will speak for you. But, Your Honor, he's mentally unstable. He talks to his dead wife. He's not capable of making rational decisions about land use. The courtroom went silent. Judge Thornton removed her glasses, fixed Sheila with a look that had probably terrified lawyers for decades. Mrs. Patterson, I talk to my dead husband every night before bed. Are you suggesting I'm mentally unstable and incapable of rational thought? Sheila's face drained of color. I didn't mean, sit down now. Sheila sat, and her attorney looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. Judge Thornton replaced her glasses, returned her attention to the documents. Judge Hayes, you've presented compelling evidence of forgery. Unless Mr. Webb can produce contrary evidence, I'm inclined to grant the temporary restraining order. Your Honor, we need time to investigate. You've had weeks to verify your documentation before filing permits and hiring contractors. You should have done your due diligence then. She signed the order with decisive strokes. Temporary restraining order granted. All construction related to the Willow Creek bike path is halted, pending a full evidentiary hearing on the easement's validity. Hearing set for 3 weeks from today. Both parties will have time to gather evidence and present full arguments. The gavel came down and Frank felt something release in his chest. Not victory, not yet, but breathing room. Time to mount a real defense, to finish Rose's conservation easement, to protect the land she'd loved. Outside the courthouse, Sheila stalked past them toward her Tesla, her attorney trying to keep up. She stopped at her car, turned back to face Frank. This isn't over, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. You won a battle. The war continues. Then we'll keep fighting, Frank said quietly, as long as it takes. She climbed into her Tesla, slammed the door, sat there for a moment staring at her phone. Frank could see her typing furiously, probably already posting to Facebook about corrupt judges and rigged systems and good people being persecuted for trying to help their communities. Diane touched his arm. Let her rant. We won today. That matters. They drove back to the ranch, and Frank spent the afternoon in Rose's garden, working the soil she'd enriched, tending plants she'd chosen, continuing work she'd started. The tomatoes Lily had planted were already showing new growth, green shoots reaching towards sun. That evening, his phone buzzed with a text from Bonnie. "You need to know something. Sheila's daughter Jennifer called me. She wants to meet. Says she has evidence that will end her mother's reign of terror." Her exact words. Frank stared at the message. Sheila had daughters. He'd forgotten that, had seen her only as an antagonist, not as a human being with family and history and relationships that shaped her behavior. "What kind of evidence?" he texted back. "Financial records, emails, things that prove the bike path was never about recreation." "Meet her? Where?" "Austin, Wednesday. I can drive us. This could be the break we need, Frank." He sat on the porch with his phone, watching evening settle over the hills. Wednesday was 2 days away. 2 days to wonder what Sheila's daughter knew. What had driven her to contact strangers about her own mother? What kind of family dysfunction created a situation where children betrayed parents to outsiders? But if Jennifer had evidence, if she could prove Sheila's real motives, it might end this fight before it destroyed everything Rose had built. Frank texted Bonnie back. "Wednesday works. What time?" 10 a.m. Coffee shop near UT campus. She doesn't want to be seen in hill country. "I'll be ready." That night, Frank dreamed of Rose for the first time since she died. They were in the garden together. Spring morning, coffee steaming in mugs she'd made at a pottery class 15 years ago. She was showing him something in her field journal, pointing to notes about seasonal migration patterns, explaining why the creek mattered not just for its water, but for the life it supported. "You're doing good work," Dream Rose said, "finishing what I started, protecting what matters." "I don't know how to do it without you," Dream Frank answered. "Yes, you do. You're already doing it. The quilting circle, the legal fight, the conservation easement, that's all my work, continuing through you." "I miss you." "I know, but I'm not gone, Frank. I'm in the garden, in the land, in Lily learning to plant tomatoes, in every woman who sits around that quilt and fights for what I loved. You're not alone." He woke at dawn, her voice still echoing in his mind, and for the first time in 16 months, the ache of her absence felt bearable. Not gone, just transformed, love changing shape, but not disappearing. Wednesday morning, Bonnie picked him up in her sensible Honda, and they drove to Austin through hill country that rolled away in endless variations of green. They didn't talk much. Bonnie was good at comfortable silence, at giving people space to think without filling every moment with words. The coffee shop was near campus, full of students hunched over laptops and textbooks, the air thick with espresso and the kind of earnest conversation that came from believing the world could still be changed through debate. Jennifer had texted a description. Brown hair, blue jacket, sitting in the back corner by the window. She stood when they approached. 28 years old, thin in the way of people who forgot to eat when stressed, eyes that looked older than her face. She shook Frank's hand with careful formality. "Mr. Morrison, thank you for meeting me. I know this is awkward." They ordered coffee, settled at the small table, and Jennifer pulled a laptop from her bag with hands that shook slightly. "I need you to understand something first. I love my mother. Or I did, before she became this person I don't recognize. The woman you're fighting isn't the mother who raised me. That woman was kind, principled, believed in justice." "What changed?" Frank asked gently. "Everything. Her career ended when I was in law school. She was a federal prosecutor, good at her job, rising star. Then she got caught taking bribes from developers she was supposed to be prosecuting. Lost her job, her reputation, everything she'd built." Jennifer's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears back. "I was the one who reported her, found evidence she was taking money, turned it in to the Justice Department. She got forced into early retirement instead of prison, but it destroyed our relationship. She blamed me for ruining her career, said I chose principles over family." "You did the right thing," Bonnie said. "Did I?" My mother's life fell apart. 2 divorces, estrangement from both her daughters, no career, no identity. She moved to hill country to start over. Became HOA president because it was the only power she could find. And now she's doing exactly what got her fired in the first place. Taking kickbacks, manipulating documents, abusing authority. Jennifer opened the laptop, pulled up files. This is 3 years of HOA financial records. My sister Amanda stole them from Mom's house. Look at the payments to vendors: Mountain Vista LLC, Hill Country Development Services, Lone Star Infrastructure. Frank studied the spreadsheet. Hundreds of thousands of dollars paid to companies he'd never heard of. Those are shell companies, Jennifer continued. I traced them. They're all registered to the same person. Gregory Ashford, my mother's second ex-husband. They're working together? Bonnie asked. Not exactly. Gregory is blackmailing her. He lost everything in bad investments, owes money to some very dangerous people. He threatened to expose Mom's bribery history unless she helped him with a development scheme. Jennifer pulled up emails, showed the message chains between Sheila and Gregory. The bike path was never about recreation. It was about establishing public access across Frank's land, so Gregory's development partners could claim eminent domain, force Frank to sell, then build 200 luxury homes on Morrison Ranch. The bike path was just the first step, Jennifer said. Once they establish public use, they file for eminent domain claiming public benefit, force you to sell at assessed value, which is way below market rate for developable land. Then Gregory's partners flip it for millions. Frank sat back, the coffee forgotten. This wasn't about Sheila's ego or community amenities. This was fraud on a scale he hadn't imagined. What partners? Texas Hill Development Corporation. They're funding the whole thing, promised to pay off Gregory's debts if he could deliver your land. And my mother went along because Gregory threatened to send evidence of her old bribery to prosecutors. She could still face charges if the right person looked at her history. Why are you telling us this? Frank asked. Jennifer met his eyes. Because I saw your granddaughter's TikTok, the one about her grandmother's garden, and I realized my mother is about to destroy another family the way she destroyed ours. I can't stop her by confronting her, but maybe you can stop her with evidence. She pushed a thumb drive across the table. Everything's on here: financial records, emails, development plans, shell company registrations, enough to prove conspiracy to commit fraud. Bonnie took the drive carefully. Jennifer, this could send your mother to prison. I know, and part of me hopes it doesn't come to that. But I'd rather she face consequences and get help than keep destroying people. She's sick, Mr. Morrison. Narcissistic personality disorder, depression, maybe more. She needs treatment, not enabling. And she needs to be stopped before she hurts anyone else. They talked for another hour. Jennifer explained the timeline, the players, the financial mechanisms Gregory had set up to hide the development scheme. By the time they left Austin, Frank's head was spinning with the complexity of it all. Bonnie drove them back in silence, then spoke as they approached Hill Country. What are you going to do? Give this to Carolyn. Let her decide how to use it. It's going to get ugly, Frank. When this comes out, Sheila will be destroyed. She was already destroying herself. We're just documenting it. That evening, Frank sat on his porch and watched the sun set over land that developers wanted to pave. Ranger grazed in the pasture, massive and content, unaware that his territory had been targeted for subdivision. Somewhere in her cottage, Grace was making dinner. In town, Diane was organizing the quilting circle for their next move. And in a coffee shop in Austin, a young woman was probably wondering if she'd done the right thing by betraying her mother to save a stranger's ranch. Frank's phone buzzed. A text from Judge Carolyn. Got the evidence from Bonnie. This is bigger than we thought. Emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Bring Diane and Grace. We're taking this to the district attorney. Frank set the phone down, picked up his coffee cup, spoke to the empty chair beside him. It's happening, Rose. Everything you started, it's all coming together. The quilting circle, the conservation easement, the truth about Sheila. We're going to win this. The wind moved through the oaks, and Frank chose to hear it as agreement. Tomorrow they would take the evidence to prosecutors. Tomorrow, the full scope of Sheila's conspiracy would come to light. Tomorrow, the fight would escalate in ways he couldn't predict. But tonight, he sat on the porch where Rose used to read field guides, on land that held her ashes, protecting gardens she'd planted, and dreams she'd dreamed. And for the first time since she died, Frank felt equal to the task. Not because he was strong enough alone, but because he'd finally learned what Rose had always known. The land was worth fighting for, and no one had to fight alone. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of silence that meant something had gone wrong. Frank woke at 4:30 like always, like 30 years of ranching had programmed his body to rise before the sun, and walked to the kitchen where 2 coffee cups waited on the counter. The ritual hadn't changed. Rose was still gone. The world kept turning anyway. He was pouring water into the coffee maker when he heard it. Ranger's bellow. Not the usual morning greeting, but something else. Something wrong. The sound carried pain and confusion and a distress that made Frank's hands freeze on the carafe. He was out the door without his boots, running across dew-soaked grass in sock feet toward the south pasture where the sound had come from. Dawn was just starting to paint the eastern sky, enough light to see shapes but not details, enough to make out Ranger standing at the fence line, with his massive head lowered. And then Frank saw the cattle, 4 of them down in the grass, bodies still. 3 more staggering, heads swaying with the kind of disorientation that meant poison or disease or something catastrophic moving through their systems. Frank's stomach dropped. He jumped the fence, ran to the nearest cow. Magnolia, 12 years old, the first Highland Rose had bought when she decided to transition from commercial cattle to heritage breeds. The cow's eyes were open but unfocused, foam at her mouth, breathing shallow and rapid. Frank pulled his phone from his pocket with shaking hands, dialed Dr. Sarah Kim's emergency number. The veterinarian answered on the second ring, voice alert despite the early hour. "Sarah, I need you at my ranch now. Cattle poisoning. At least 4 dead, 3 more showing symptoms." "On my way. Don't let the others drink from the water source. Keep them isolated if you can. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Frank moved through the pasture in a nightmare, checking each animal. Buttercup, dead. Daisy, dead. Clementine, the calf born the week after Rose died, the one Frank had bottle-fed when her mother rejected her, dead. Each name was a memory, each animal a piece of Rose's breeding program, her vision of sustainable ranching, her belief that heritage genetics mattered. Marigold was still alive but barely, white foam coating her muzzle, legs trembling. Violet stood nearby, swaying, eyes glazed. And Poppy, Rose's favorite, the gentle cow who'd let children pet her at the county fair. She was down but breathing, each breath a struggle. Ranger stood at the edge of the carnage, bellowing his distress. The bull hadn't touched whatever had poisoned the others, had stayed near his own water trough in the north pasture. But he knew. Animals always knew when their herd was dying. Dr. Kim's truck came up the drive faster than was safe, scattering gravel. She was out before the engine stopped, medical kit in hand, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd spent 20 years treating rural emergencies. "Tell me what you found." 4 dead when I got here at 4:30, 3 showing symptoms, disorientation, foam at mouth, trembling, labored breathing. She knelt beside Marigold, checked vitals, examined the foam. "This is organophosphate poisoning. Agricultural pesticide, the kind that's been banned in Texas for 5 years. She looked up at Frank. Someone did this deliberately. The words hit like a physical blow. Deliberate. Not accident, not disease, not bad luck. Someone had come onto his property and poisoned Rose's cattle because they wanted to hurt him. Dr. Kim was already pulling equipment from her kit. "Help me get IVs started. We might be able to save these 3 if we move fast." They worked through the sunrise, Frank holding animals still while Dr. Kim inserted needles, hung bags of fluids, administered activated charcoal and atropine. Marigold responded first, her breathing easing, eyes clearing slightly. Violet followed, but Poppy, sweet, gentle Poppy who Rose had loved best, slipped away despite everything they tried. By the time the sun was fully up, 5 cattle were dead, and 2 were fighting for survival. Frank sat in the grass beside Marigold, one hand on her warm flank, and felt something break inside him that had nothing to do with property or money or the price of replacement animals. These were Rose's. She'd chosen each one, had known their personalities, their quirks, their bloodlines. She'd bred them with careful attention to genetics and temperament, building a herd that could thrive on native grasses without antibiotics or growth hormones. This wasn't just livestock. This was living testimony to her vision, and someone had destroyed it to hurt Frank. Dr. Kim approached with a sample kit. "I'm taking water from the creek for testing, but Frank, I can tell you right now what happened. Someone dumped pesticide upstream from your property, probably last night. The concentration would have been highest in the early morning when the cattle went to drink." "Can you prove it was deliberate?" The chemicals will prove it was pesticide. The location will prove it was targeted. This isn't accidental runoff. Someone wanted to kill your animals. Sheriff Dana Thompson arrived at 7, called by Dr. Kim while Frank was holding Poppy through her final moments. The sheriff was 52, third-generation law enforcement, a woman who'd grown up on a ranch and understood that cattle weren't just assets. They were family. She walked the scene methodically, photographing the dead animals, the creek, the pasture. Dr. Kim showed her the water samples, explained the chemistry. Thompson took notes in a small leather book that looked older than she was. Frank, I need to check upstream. Where's your property line? He showed her the fence that separated his land from the public easement, the strip of county-owned ground that ran along the creek for flood control. They walked it together, looking for evidence. They found it half a mile up. Empty pesticide containers, commercial grade, the kind that required permits to purchase. Thrown carelessly into the brush, labels still visible. Malathion, banned for agricultural use since 2019 because of its toxicity to wildlife and livestock. Sheriff Thompson photographed everything, bagged the containers, documented the GPS coordinates. This is criminal trespass, vandalism, animal cruelty, possibly attempted murder if they intended the poison to affect humans too. Who would do this? Thompson looked at him with eyes that had seen too much rural crime to be shocked anymore. Someone who wants you gone. Someone who benefits from you selling your property. Someone who's already shown a pattern of harassment and escalation. Sheila Patterson. I didn't say that, but I will be interviewing Mrs. Patterson and anyone associated with her HOA activities. And Frank, I need you to be careful. Whoever did this, they've crossed a line from legal harassment to felony violence. That makes them dangerous. Frank spent the rest of the morning burying his dead cattle. Normally, he'd have called the renderer, would have had the carcasses removed for processing. But these were Rose's animals. They deserved better than an industrial grave. He chose a spot in the north pasture, away from the creek, where wildflowers grew thick in spring. The backhoe rumbled and dug, cutting through soil that had never been turned, creating a pit deep enough for 5 bodies. That's where Lily found him. She'd ridden her bike from town, 11 miles on county roads, arriving sweaty and scared with her phone in her hand, showing the text he'd sent her father. Cattle poisoned, 5 dead. I'm okay. Stay home. She hadn't stayed home. Grandpa. He turned from the grave he was digging, saw his granddaughter standing at the fence, her face pale, her eyes understanding too much too fast. You shouldn't be here, honey. Where else would I be? She climbed the fence, walked to where the dead cattle lay in a row waiting for burial. Magnolia, Buttercup, Daisy, Clementine, Poppy, each one named after flowers in Rose's garden. Each one a piece of the legacy someone had destroyed. Who did this? We don't know yet. But you know, I can see it in your face. Someone poisoned them because of the bike path. Frank wanted to lie, wanted to protect her from the ugliness of what people did to each other when they wanted something badly enough. But Lily was 12 years old, and she'd already lost her grandmother. She deserved the truth. Probably. Sheriff Thompson is investigating. Lily knelt beside Clementine, the calf she'd helped bottle feed after Rose died, and put her hand on the still warm body. Grandma would hate this. Not just because they died, because someone made them hurt. I know. Are you going to quit? Sell the ranch and let them win? The question cut deeper than she knew. Part of Frank wanted exactly that. Wanted to sell everything, take Lily and Grace and move somewhere the past didn't hurt so much, where Rose's absence wasn't carved into every fence post and garden bed. Somewhere he didn't have to fight people who poisoned animals to make a point. But that wasn't what Rose would have wanted. She'd spent 30 years building something here, had fought developers and skeptics and people who thought ranching was dead industry, had proved that sustainable agriculture could work, that heritage genetics mattered, that land was worth protecting even when protecting it was hard. No, Frank said, we're not quitting. Good, because I want to help bury them. They were grandma's, which means they're ours. They deserve a real funeral. So they buried the cattle together, grandfather and granddaughter, lowering bodies into earth and covering them with soil that would eventually become grass. Lily found wildflower seeds in Rose's garden shed and scattered them over the grave. By next spring, the burial site would bloom with Indian paintbrush and bluebonnets, a living memorial to animals who died in a war they never understood. When it was done, Lily pulled out her phone. I'm making another video. People need to know what happened. Frank started to object, then stopped. Lily understood social media in ways he never would. Understood that stories mattered, that showing the cost of cruelty could move people who wouldn't respond to abstract arguments about property rights. She filmed the grave, filmed Ranger standing watch over the place where his herdmates were buried, filmed her own dirt-stained hands and tear-streaked face. "Someone poisoned my grandpa's cattle," she said to the camera, her voice steady despite the tears. "6 of them. Killed them because my grandpa won't let them destroy my grandma's garden. These cows had names: Magnolia, Buttercup, Daisy, Clementine, Poppy, Violet. My grandma raised them. Now they're dead because someone wanted to hurt us." She showed the grave, the wildflower seeds, Ranger's massive form silhouetted against the morning sky. This is what happens when people value money over life, when they think concrete is more important than animals, when they forget that cruelty has costs. She lowered the phone, ended the recording. "I'll post it tonight, after you've talked to the sheriff again. I want the investigation started before this goes viral." Frank looked at his 12-year-old granddaughter and saw Rose in her eyes. The same determination, the same unwillingness to let injustice pass unchallenged, the same belief that showing truth could change hearts. "When did you get so wise?" "Grandma taught me, even though I didn't know I was learning." That afternoon, Sheriff Thompson called with news. "We found security footage from the gas station on County Road 12. Shows a vehicle pulling onto the public easement at 11:43 p.m. last night. Too dark to see plates, but the vehicle profile matches a Honda Civic. Sheila drives a Tesla. Sheila Patterson does. But Derek Walsh, her HOA assistant, drives a white Honda Civic. And I just pulled his credit card records. He purchased agricultural chemicals from Farm Supply Plus 3 days ago. $500 worth of malathion. Can you arrest him?" "Working on the warrant now. Should have him in custody by evening. But Frank, Walsh has hired help. He won't have acted alone. Someone told him to do this." "Sheila." "Probably. But proving it is harder. Walsh might flip, might testify against her for a plea deal, or he might lawyer up and stay silent. Either way, this is escalating beyond civil harassment. We're talking felony charges now." When the call ended, Frank sat on his porch and stared at the south pasture, where 5 animals had died because someone wanted his land badly enough to kill for it. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that Rose used to stop everything to photograph. His phone buzzed, a text from Diane. "Emergency quilting circle tonight. 7 p.m. my house. Bonnie says we need to talk about protection." Frank drove to Diane's house as darkness fell across hill country. 15 women were already there, gathered around Rose's memorial quilt, which was nearly finished now. Each square told a story, each piece of fabric a memory, the whole thing a testimony to a life that had mattered. Bonnie stood when Frank entered, her nurse's competence shifting to something harder. Derek Walsh was arrested an hour ago, charged with animal cruelty, criminal trespass, and illegal use of banned pesticides. But Frank, he's already out on bail, posted by someone at Willow Creek HOA. He's back on the street. How's that possible? His attorney argued he was low flight risk, first offense, strong community ties. Judge set bail at $50,000. Someone paid it immediately. Judge Carolyn spoke up from her corner. That someone was Sheila Patterson, or rather, the HOA emergency fund she controls. She just used community money to bail out her assistant who poisoned your cattle. The room erupted in outrage, 15 women talking at once, shock and anger mixing into a sound that would have been chaos if Diane hadn't stood and held up her hands. "Quiet, we need strategy, not emotion." The room settled. Diane continued. "Bonnie's daughter-in-law has been examining the HOA financial records that Jennifer gave us. Maria, you want to explain what she found?" Maria Rodriguez stood, pulled out a laptop. "My daughter-in-law, Lucia, is a forensic accountant. She's found evidence of systematic embezzlement. Over 3 years, Sheila has stolen approximately $340,000 from HOA funds. She pulled up spreadsheets, showed payment after payment to shell companies that didn't exist, vendor invoices for work that was never done, expense reimbursements for personal purchases disguised as HOA business. This is wire fraud, embezzlement, and potentially racketeering if we can prove she was working with others. It's federal crime territory." Judge Carolyn nodded. "I've already contacted the FBI. They're opening an investigation. But these things move slowly. Meanwhile, Sheila is getting desperate. Desperate people do dangerous things." Grace spoke from her seat by the window, 78 years of Texas wisdom in her voice. We need to protect Frank. 24-hour watch on his property. If Sheila's willing to poison cattle, she might escalate to worse. I can't ask you ladies to do that. You're not asking, Grace said firmly. We're telling. Starting tonight, there will be 2 women on your property at all times. 4-hour shifts around the clock. We'll be armed, we'll be alert, and we'll document anyone who comes near your ranch. Bonnie pulled out a schedule. I've already organized it. We've got coverage through next week. Grace and I take midnight to 4 a.m. tonight. Frank looked at these women, most of them grandmothers, some of them dealing with their own health issues, all of them willing to sit guard through dark hours to protect a widower's ranch. The weight of it threatened to break him. Thank you, all of you. Diane came to him, put her hand on his shoulder. Rose built this circle. We're just continuing her work. And Frank, there's something else. She showed him Lily's video, the one his granddaughter had filmed that morning. 600,000 views in 8 hours. Comments from across the country. Outrage and support flooding in. People offering donations for legal fees. Journalists asking to cover the story. This has gone national. Lily's given you something money can't buy. She's given you a platform. That night, Grace and Bonnie sat in Frank's kitchen with thermoses of coffee and Grace's deer rifle propped against the counter. The house felt different with other people in it. Less like a tomb of memories, and more like a living space where the present still mattered. Frank tried to sleep, but couldn't. Kept seeing Poppy's eyes as she died. Kept hearing Ranger's distress. Kept thinking about the kind of person who could poison animals and sleep soundly afterward. At 2 a.m. he gave up. Walked to the kitchen where Grace and Bonnie sat playing cards under the overhead light. Can't sleep? Grace asked. Keep thinking. About Rose? About everything. Rose, the cattle, what happens next. Whether I'm doing the right thing fighting this. Grace set down her cards. Frank, you've been fighting for Rose's legacy. Maybe it's time to fight for something else too. Like what? The future. Lily's future. That child has found purpose in defending this land. She's learned about loyalty and courage and standing up to bullies. That matters more than the ranch itself. Bonnie added quietly. I've been documenting Sheila for over a year. I've watched her destroy good people who challenged her. Tom Bradley, who questioned her budget. Susan Chen, who complained about harassment. Marcus Webb, who she divorced when he became a liability. She leaves scorched earth behind her. Someone has to stop her, Grace said. Not for revenge, for all the people she'll hurt next if she wins here. Frank poured coffee, stood at the window looking at darkness punctuated by stars. Somewhere out there, Ranger slept in the pasture. Somewhere in town, Derek Walsh was home on bail paid with money meant for community improvement. And somewhere, probably in her expensive house in Willow Creek, Sheila Patterson was planning her next move. Thursday morning brought Dr. Maria Santos to the ranch. She was 40 years old, Latina, with a PhD in environmental biology from UT Austin and a history with Rose that went back to grad school. Frank Morrison. She shook his hand with both of hers. I'm so sorry about Rose. I should have come to the funeral, but I was in Costa Rica doing field work. I just heard about the bike path fight. You knew Rose? We were in the same doctoral program. She was brilliant, passionate about conservation. When Diane called and told me what was happening, I knew I had to help. She spent 3 days surveying Frank's property, with equipment that looked more like science fiction than biology. Soil samples, water testing, acoustic monitors for bird species, cameras for nocturnal animals. She cataloged everything Rose had documented 15 years ago and updated it with current data. On Sunday, she presented her findings to Frank, Diane, and Judge Carolyn in Frank's living room. Your wife's research was impeccable. 47 species documented, 12 of them rare or threatened in Texas. But there's something she missed because the species hadn't been identified yet. Maria pulled out photos of a small amphibian, rust-colored with distinctive markings. This is Eurasea hillcountryensis, the hill country salamander, discovered and classified in 2021, 3 years after Rose died. It's found in exactly 3 locations in Texas. Your creek is one of them. Is it protected? Under the Endangered Species Act, yes, which means any development that would impact its habitat requires federal environmental review. The bike path would destroy critical breeding grounds. If built, it would violate federal law. Judge Carolyn leaned forward. Can you testify to this? I can do better. I can file an endangered species petition with Fish and Wildlife Service. Once filed, all development stops pending federal review. That review takes months, sometimes years. Frank felt something shift, pieces falling into place. Rose had done the foundational work. Maria was completing it. And together, they were building a defense that went beyond property rights into fundamental questions of ecological preservation. Do it, he said, file the petition. Monday brought the first crack in Sheila's armor. The local newspaper published an investigative piece about HOA finances, citing unnamed sources and forensic accounting that showed systematic irregularities. The article stopped short of naming Sheila directly, but anyone with basic reading comprehension could connect the dots. By Tuesday, 3 HOA board members had resigned, citing concerns about financial management and legal liability. By Wednesday, Willow Creek residents were organizing an emergency meeting to discuss leadership changes. And on Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the cattle poisoning, Bonnie showed up at Frank's door with a petition. We're recalling Sheila. This is the official paperwork. We need signatures from 2/3 of HOA members to force a vote. Frank looked at the document. Clean, legal, devastating. How many signatures do you have? 92 households out of 210. That's 44% in 3 days. We're going door to door this weekend. Grace is leading the charge with the older residents. Maria is working the Hispanic community. And I'm hitting every household with school-age kids, showing them Lily's video. What can I do? Nothing. This is our fight now. You focus on the conservation easement and the endangered species petition. Let us handle Sheila. The weekend brought a transformation Frank wouldn't have believed possible. The quilting circle mobilized with the efficiency of a military operation, canvassing Willow Creek estates in coordinated teams. They weren't aggressive or confrontational. They just showed up with facts, photos, and a simple question. Do you want to be represented by someone who poisons animals and embezzles community funds? By Sunday evening, Bonnie called with the final count. 179 signatures, 85% of HOA membership, were filing the recall petition tomorrow morning. Frank stood on his porch listening to her voice, watching sunset paint the hills, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 16 months. Hope. Not certainty, not victory, but the possibility that justice might actually prevail. Monday morning at 9 a.m., Bonnie filed the recall petition with the HOA management company. By law, Sheila had 30 days to schedule a recall vote. By 10 a.m., she'd called an emergency board meeting for that evening. Frank didn't attend. This was Willow Creek's fight, not his, but Grace went, along with half the quilting circle, and what Bonnie estimated was 160 residents. The community center where they held HOA meetings was designed for 50 people. More than 3 times that many showed up. Grace called Frank at 8 p.m. with a report. Sheila tried to call the meeting to order, got shouted down, tried to claim the petition was invalid because of technical errors. Judge Carolyn stood up and explained property law for 10 minutes, proved every word of the petition was legally sound. What did Sheila do? Lost her composure completely, started screaming about conspiracies and personal vendettas, accused you of orchestrating the whole thing, said you were manipulating gullible women who couldn't think for themselves. That went over well? Like a lead balloon. Maria Rodriguez stood up and said, Mrs. Patterson, I have a PhD in biology and 40 years of community organizing experience. Don't you dare call me gullible. Got a standing ovation. Frank smiled despite himself. When's the vote? 2 weeks from tonight, April 15th. Sheila has 14 days to change minds or watch her presidency end. Those 14 days became a war of information. Sheila hired a Dallas public relations firm, plastered Willow Creek with mailers talking about her vision for the community, her years of service, the conspiracy against her by outside agitators who didn't live in the subdivision. The quilting circle countered with facts. They published the financial irregularities. They showed timelines of harassment against residents who'd questioned Sheila's decisions. They documented the cattle poisoning, Derek Walsh's arrest, the bail money from HOA funds. And they kept quilting. Rose's memorial quilt was finished now. 80 squares of testimony to a woman who'd built community through service. The quilting circle hung it in the community center, where every resident would see it during the recall vote. Each square told a story. Grace's showed Rose's tomatoes, Maria's showed her roses, Bonnie's showed Rose teaching first aid. And Lily's, the newest square, showed rangers standing guard over a garden, a 12-year-old's tribute to her grandmother's belief that protection was an act of love. Frank spent those 2 weeks finishing what Rose had started. With Judge Carolyn's help, he gathered signatures from all 6 neighboring ranchers for the conservation easement. With Maria's help, he filed the endangered species petition that would protect the hill country salamander. With Diane's help, he documented Rose's life's work in a format that state agencies could understand and act upon. The land Rose had loved was fighting back through the people she'd built relationships with, through the networks she'd created, through the community she'd believed in, even when that community didn't know it existed. April 15th arrived with thunderstorms that cleared by evening, leaving the air scrubbed clean and smelling of rain-soaked earth. Frank drove to Willow Creek Community Center at 6 p.m., not because he had any official role, but because Grace had asked him to come. Rose would want you to see this, she'd said, would want you to witness community choosing right over easy. The parking lot was full, cars overflowing onto side streets, people walking through puddles to get to a meeting that would determine whether truth mattered more than power. Frank found a spot in the back, walked toward the building where lights blazed against gathering darkness. Inside, 300 people packed a space meant for 50, standing room only, residents overflowing into hallways, tension so thick Frank could taste it. Sheila stood at the front in designer clothes that probably cost more than most attendees spent on groceries in a month, her expression controlled, but her eyes showing panic. The HOA president pro tem called the meeting to order, explained the rules. Each side would get 10 minutes to make their case, then a secret ballot vote. Simple majority needed to remove Sheila from office. Sheila spoke first, her lawyer's training evident in how she structured arguments and deployed rhetoric. She talked about her years of service, about the improvements she'd brought to Willow Creek, about the bike path as a symbol of progress and community health. She painted herself as a victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by a grieving rancher who couldn't accept change. "I have given everything to this community," she said, voice breaking in what might have been genuine emotion or calculated performance. "My time, my energy, my personal resources. And this is how you repay me? With recall petitions based on lies and innuendo?" Then Diane stood to speak for the recall. She walked to the front carrying a simple folder. No dramatics, no rhetoric. Just facts delivered in a retired teacher's voice that expected to be heard. "Sheila Patterson embezzled $340,000 from this HOA over 3 years. We have forensic accounting to prove it. She forged legal documents to justify taking private land for development. We have the original county records to prove it. She used HOA funds to bail out an employee who poisoned livestock. We have receipts to prove it." Diane opened the folder, showed page after page of evidence. Bank statements, vendor invoices, email chains, all projected onto a screen where everyone could see. This recall isn't personal. It's not about bike paths or ranchers or who gets to decide what progress means. It's about whether we accept leaders who lie, steal, and abuse power. That's the only question before us tonight. The room erupted. Some people shouting support for Sheila, more shouting for accountability, everyone talking at once until the president pro tem had to bang a gavel for 5 minutes straight to restore order. They voted in silence, each household receiving 1 ballot, secret and binding. The counting took 40 minutes, 4 volunteers checking and rechecking every mark. When the results came back, the president pro tem's voice shook as she read them. Total ballots cast 208. Votes to remove Sheila Patterson from office, 179. Votes to retain, 29. The recall passes. Mrs. Patterson, effective immediately, you are removed from all HOA leadership positions. The room exploded in applause and outrage and chaos. Sheila stood frozen at the front, face drained of color, world collapsing around her. Frank watched from the back and felt no satisfaction, no triumph. Just exhaustion and sadness for everyone involved. Sheila grabbed her phone, her purse, walked toward the exit with her head high even as people shouted questions and accusations. She passed within 5 feet of Frank, and their eyes met for just a moment. What he saw there wasn't anger or defiance. It was devastation. The look of someone who'd lost everything, whose identity had been built on power, and was now facing a void. She walked out into the parking lot, climbed into her white Tesla, sat there for a long moment just breathing. Frank could see her through the window, face in her hands, shoulders shaking, Diane came to stand beside him. We won. Did we? Look at her. She did this to herself, Frank. Every choice, every lie, every act of cruelty. We didn't destroy her. We just stopped enabling her. I know, doesn't make it feel good. They stood in the doorway watching Sheila's Tesla, watching a woman come apart in the privacy of her expensive car. And Frank thought about Rose, about how she'd fought developers and skeptics and people who wanted to pave over everything she loved. But she'd never celebrated their defeats, had never taken joy in anyone's downfall. She'd understood something Frank was only beginning to learn: that justice wasn't about destroying enemies. It was about protecting what mattered and hoping everyone involved could find a way to be better tomorrow than they were today. Inside, the quilting circle was celebrating, hugging each other, already planning next steps. Outside, Sheila finally started her Tesla, drove away into darkness, and Frank wondered if this was the end of the war or just the end of a battle. His phone buzzed. A text from Lily. "Grandpa, did we win?" Frank typed back slowly. "Yes." The recall passed. "Sheila's out." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, "Good. Now can we finish Grandma's conservation easement?" Frank smiled for the first time all evening. "Yes, honey. Now we finish what she started." He drove home through hill country darkness, past ranches that had survived 100 years of drought and flood and market crashes and wars, past land that would outlive everyone who fought over it, that would remember long after memories failed. At the ranch, rangers stood at the fence waiting. Frank stopped the truck, got out, walked to where the bull could lower his massive head for a scratch between the horns. "We won tonight, boy. Not the war, but a battle. Sheila's gone. The bike path stopped. Rose's work is safe." The bull made a low rumbling sound, contentment mixed with alertness. He was still guarding, still watching, still ready to protect territory that someone had tried to take. Frank stood in the darkness with his hand on 7 years of loyalty, looking at land that held his wife's ashes, and his grandfather's dreams, and his granddaughter's future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There was still the conservation easement to finalize, still the endangered species petition to process, still Derek Walsh's trial, and probably Sheila's too, if federal prosecutors moved forward. But tonight, for the first time since Rose died, Frank felt like he was winning instead of just surviving. He walked to the memorial grove where oak trees stood watch over soil that held Rose's remains. The bench was wet from rain, but he sat anyway, letting the dampness soak through his jeans. "We won the recall, Rosie. Sheila's out." Grace led the charge. Diane presented the evidence. And 86% of Willow Creek voted her gone. Your quilting circle did in 2 weeks what I couldn't have done in 2 years. The wind moved through oak branches, and Frank let himself believe it was answer enough. "Tomorrow we finish your conservation easement. Maria found your salamander, the one you suspected was here, but died before you could prove it. Federal protection, Rose. Your creek is going to be safe." He sat until the cold drove him inside, until the memorial grove was just shadows and starlight, until he could believe that fighting for what mattered was worth the cost even when the cost was high. Inside, he set 2 coffee cups on the counter for morning, looked at Rose's photo on the mantel, and spoke to the empty house. "We're not done yet, but we're getting there." And somewhere in the darkness, the land listened and remembered and waited for sunrise. The morning after the recall vote arrived with the kind of quiet that felt like the world holding its breath. Frank woke to his usual ritual: 2 coffee cups on the counter, Rose's chair empty at the table, and the weight of victory that felt less like triumph and more like exhaustion. They'd won. Sheila was out. The bike path was stopped, and yet the fight had cost something that couldn't be measured in acres or easements or legal victories. 5 cattle were buried in the north pasture. A 12-year-old girl had learned that cruelty was real and sometimes won temporary battles. And a woman who'd once been a respected federal prosecutor was sitting somewhere in an expensive house, probably staring at her own ruin and wondering how she'd fallen so far. Frank carried his coffee to the porch and watched sunrise paint the hills in shades that Rose used to photograph. Ranger was already up, grazing in the pasture, with the slow contentment of an animal who knew his territory was safe. The bull had been calmer since the recall vote, as if he too understood that the immediate threat had passed. But Frank knew better than to mistake a battle for a war. Sheila Patterson wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. Bonnie had warned him. Judge Carolyn had warned him. Even Jennifer, Sheila's own daughter, had said her mother's desperation made her dangerous. The phone rang at 7 a.m., Sheriff Thompson's number. "Frank, I need you to know something. Sheila Patterson was arrested last night at 2 a.m. outside the Willow Creek HOA office. Breaking and entering, attempted theft of documents, destruction of property." Frank set down his coffee carefully. What was she doing? Trying to destroy evidence, the financial records, meeting minutes, anything that could be used against her in the FBI investigation. She smashed a window to get in, used her old keys before the board changed locks, started shredding documents. Security company caught her on camera. Is she in custody? Was. Judge set bail at $10,000. Her daughter Amanda posted it this morning, but Frank, she's unraveling. When we arrested her, she was screaming about conspiracies, about you orchestrating her downfall, about how everything she'd built was being destroyed by people who couldn't understand her vision. Where is she now? Home. Under orders not to contact you or anyone associated with the HOA. But I'm telling you this because desperate people do desperate things. You need to stay vigilant. After the call, Frank sat on the porch and thought about Sheila, about a woman who'd once prosecuted environmental crimes for the Justice Department, who'd believed in law and order and justice, who'd fallen so far that she was now breaking windows at 2 a.m. to destroy evidence of her own corruption. What made someone travel that road? Was it one big decision or 1,000 small compromises? Was it ambition or fear, or just the slow erosion of principles under pressure? Rose would have said everyone deserved compassion, even people who'd done harm. She'd visited Sheila in the hospital after her daughter's death, had tried to offer comfort despite their legal history. Frank had never known that until Jennifer revealed it, had never understood the depth of Rose's capacity for mercy. Could he offer the same? Could he look at the woman who'd poisoned his cattle and forged documents and tried to destroy his wife's legacy and see a human being worthy of compassion? He didn't know, but he suspected Rose would want him to try. Thursday morning brought Maria Santos back to the ranch with news about the conservation easement. She sat at Frank's kitchen table with maps and legal documents spread across the surface where Rose used to plan her research. "All 6 ranchers have signed," Maria said, pointing to signatures on the easement agreement. Frank Morrison, Bill and Patricia Thompson, Carlos and Maria Rodriguez, the Kowalski Family Trust, James Chen, and the Blackwell Ranch Partnership. Together, that's 1,400 acres of protected land. When can we file? Judge Carolyn has the paperwork ready. We're filing with the state on Monday, with the Conservation Trust on Tuesday. Once it's recorded, it becomes permanent. No development, no subdivision, no bike paths. The land is protected in perpetuity. Frank traced the boundary lines on the map, seeing the corridor Rose had envisioned. Creek watershed, wildlife habitat. Working ranch land, all preserved for generations, that would never know her name, but would benefit from her vision. She'd be proud, he said quietly. She'd be ecstatic. Frank, do you understand what this means? In 50 years, 100 years, when hill country is covered in subdivisions and strip malls, this corridor will still be here, still wild, still working, still supporting the species Rose documented. That's immortality. That afternoon, Frank drove to the memorial grove where Rose's ashes were scattered under the oaks. He'd been coming here every day since she died, talking to soil and trees and the memory of a woman who'd believed land was worth fighting for. The bench needed repair. The wood had weathered 16 months of Texas sun and rain, and one of the legs was starting to rot. Frank had brought tools to fix it, was kneeling in the dirt examining the damage when he noticed something unusual. The ground beneath the bench had settled unevenly, creating a depression on one side, and in that depression, partly exposed by erosion, was the corner of a metal box. Frank dug carefully with his hands, pulling away soil and grass until he could lift out a container about the size of a shoebox. Stainless steel, weathered but intact, with a simple latch that opened easily. Inside was a time capsule. Frank recognized Rose's handwriting immediately on the paper inside, dated May 15th, 1982, their wedding year. "To whoever finds this," Rose had written. "Frank and I buried this capsule under our proposal oak on the day we chose this spot for our first home. We've been married 3 months, and we're still figuring out what forever means. But we know this. We want to build something that lasts. Not just a house or a family, but a legacy. Something that makes the world a little better than we found it." Frank is teaching me about ranching. I'm teaching him about conservation. Together, we're learning that land doesn't belong to us. We belong to it. We're temporary. The land is permanent. Inside this capsule, photos from our wedding, pressed flowers from my first garden, a soil sample from the creek, Frank's grandfather's pocket watch, my field notes from our first species count. Things that matter to us today. May 15th, 1982. To you, whoever you are, whenever you are. I hope this land is still here. I hope the creek still flows clean. I hope someone is still fighting to protect it. Love compounds across time. Plant something beautiful today. Rose Morrison, age 22, newly married, full of hope. Frank sat back in the dirt, holding the letter with shaking hands. Inside the capsule was everything she'd described, photos of them young and impossibly optimistic, pressed wildflowers that had somehow kept their color, a vial of creek water, now evaporated, but the label still clear in Rose's careful handwriting, his grandfather's watch, still ticking after 43 years, and her field notes. The first species count she'd ever done on this land, dated June 1982, 19 species documented. The beginning of work that would eventually catalog 47, that would prove this land was irreplaceable, that would justify the conservation easement they were about to file. Frank pulled out his phone, called Diane. She answered on the first ring. I found something in the Memorial Grove, a time capsule Rose buried the year we got married. What's in it? He told her. The letter, the photos, the field notes, the message about love compounding across time. Frank, that's beautiful. And perfect timing. The conservation easement ceremony is scheduled for next month. We should display the capsule, let people see what Rose was building even back then. Display it where? At the dedication. We're planning a big event, didn't I tell you? Community celebration, the whole county invited. We're dedicating the Rose Morrison Memorial Conservation Corridor on June 20th. That's her birthday. Frank hadn't known they were planning this. Hadn't realized that Rose's birthday would become a day of public celebration. That her private work would be honored so publicly. Who's we? The quilting circle, the ranchers in the easement, the conservation trust. Frank, Rose touched hundreds of lives. People want to celebrate what she built and what you're finishing. He sat in the memorial grove holding his young wife's message from the past and felt time collapse. The Rose who'd written this letter and the Rose who died in his arms were the same person, separated by 41 years of marriage and work and love. And here he was, an old man now, finishing what a young woman had dreamed about before she understood how hard dreams were to protect. Friday morning brought new trouble in the form of construction equipment pulling onto Frank's property at 6 a.m. He was in the barn feeding Ranger when he heard the diesel engines, that distinctive rumble that meant heavy machinery moving earth. By the time he got to the east pasture, a mini excavator was already cutting into soil. Frank ran toward it, yelling. But the operator either didn't hear or didn't care. Behind the excavator, a dump truck waited, and standing beside it in designer athleisure and expensive sunglasses was Sheila Patterson. Stop! Frank shouted. This is private property! The excavator shut down. The operator, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, climbed out of the cab. Sheila walked toward Frank with the kind of rigid determination that comes from having nothing left to lose. Her face was drawn, makeup not quite covering the dark circles under her eyes. She'd lost weight since the recall, the kind that comes from not eating rather than careful dieting. This bike path is happening, Frank, with or without HOA approval, with or without your permission. You were removed from office. You have no authority here. I don't need authority. I have $8,000 in rental equipment and 4 men who'll work for cash. We're building this path today. You'll be arrested for trespassing. Then arrest me. I don't care anymore. You've already destroyed my career, my reputation, my position in the community. What else can you take? Frank looked at this woman who'd once terrified him with her power and resources, and saw someone completely broken. Sheila, you need to stop. You need help. I need you to understand what you've done. This bike path represented everything I was trying to build after my career ended. It was my redemption project, my proof that I could still create something meaningful. And you destroyed it because you can't let go of a dead woman's gardens. The cruelty in her voice was undercut by desperation. She was lashing out because she was drowning, and Frank happened to be close enough to hit. Rose isn't dead to me, he said quietly. And her work matters. Not just to me, but to everyone who'll benefit from protected habitat. Your bike path would have destroyed irreplaceable ecosystem. Your wife was a self-righteous environmental extremist who cared more about salamanders than people. Frank felt anger rise hot in his chest, but something in Sheila's face stopped him. She wanted him to respond with rage, wanted him to validate her narrative that he was the villain, wanted any emotion other than pity. He wouldn't give her that. My wife was someone who believed the world was worth protecting. I'm sorry you can't see that. He pulled out his phone, called Sheriff Thompson. While he waited, Sheila stood beside her rented excavator looking lost, her hired workers shifting uncomfortably, the morning sun revealing how much this fight had cost her. The sheriff arrived with a deputy, took statements, documented the scene. Sheila didn't resist when they explained she was under arrest for criminal trespassing, vandalism, and violation of court orders. Mrs. Patterson, you were explicitly told to stay away from this property. I was trying to build something beautiful. You were breaking the law. They handcuffed her gently, professionally, and walked her to the patrol car. She turned back once to look at Frank, and what he saw in her eyes was the same thing he'd felt after Rose died. Complete loss of purpose. The realization that everything you'd built your identity around was gone, and you didn't know who you were without it. The patrol car drove away, and Frank stood in the pasture where Sheila had tried to carve her redemption out of his wife's legacy. The hired workers packed up the equipment, apologizing in broken English, explaining they just needed the work and hadn't understood the situation. Frank paid them for their trouble, gave them the cash Sheila probably hadn't intended to actually provide, and watched them drive away. That evening, Diane came to the ranch with news. Sheila's daughters are here, Jennifer and Amanda. They drove down from Austin when they heard about the arrest. They're asking if you'd be willing to meet with them. Why? They want to apologize and they want to ask you not to press additional charges. Frank sat on his porch looking at land Sheila had tried to destroy and thought about Rose, about how she'd visited Sheila after her daughter's overdose, how she'd offered compassion to someone who would eventually try to erase her legacy. Rose had understood something about mercy that Frank was still learning. Tell them to come tomorrow, 10 a.m. I'll meet them. Jennifer and Amanda Patterson arrived Saturday morning in a car that had seen better days. Two women in their late 20s who looked exhausted by their mother's unraveling. They sat at Frank's kitchen table drinking coffee he'd made too strong, and for a while no one knew how to start. Finally, Jennifer spoke. Mr. Morrison, we're sorry for everything our mother did. The cattle poisoning, the forged documents, the harassment. We're sorry we didn't stop her sooner. You're not responsible for your mother's choices. Maybe not, but we saw the warning signs, the paranoia, the obsession with the bike path, the way she talked about you like you were the source of all her problems. We should have intervened, should have gotten her psychiatric help before it came to this. Amanda, the younger sister, wiped tears from her face. Our mother wasn't always like this. She used to believe in justice, in protecting people. Something broke in her when she lost her career. When our sister Melissa died, she couldn't forgive herself, so she blamed everyone else. I know about Melissa, Frank said gently. Jennifer told us. I'm sorry for your loss. Mom never processed it. Never went to therapy, never dealt with the guilt. Just threw herself into being HOA president like that could fill the hole. And when you challenged her, you became the symbol of everything she'd failed at. Jennifer pulled out a folder. We brought her medical records, psychiatric evaluations from last year. She was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, depression, and complex PTSD from childhood trauma. The psychiatrist recommended intensive treatment. Mom refused. What are you asking me? Don't press charges for yesterday's trespassing. Let her get help instead. She's already facing federal charges for embezzlement and fraud. That's enough to force her into treatment as part of any plea deal. But if you pile on more charges, she'll just fight harder, get more desperate. Frank looked at these young women who'd lost their sister to an overdose and were now watching their mother destroy herself in a different way. They were asking for mercy for someone who'd shown him none. What does your mother want? She doesn't know we're here. She'd be furious if she knew. But Mr. Morrison, she's sick. Not evil, just sick. And punishment without treatment won't fix what's broken. Frank stood, walked to the window where he could see the memorial grove. Rose had believed in second chances, in compassion even for people who'd caused harm, in the possibility of redemption. I won't press additional charges, but on two conditions. Your mother enters psychiatric treatment immediately. Real treatment, not token therapy. And she stays away from my property, my family, and anything related to the conservation easement. Forever. Jennifer nodded, tears streaming. Thank you. We'll make sure she gets help. And one more thing. When your mother is healthy enough to hear it, tell her this. My wife visited her after Melissa died. Rose didn't tell me because she didn't need recognition for kindness. But I know she tried to help your mother forgive herself. That offer stands. When Sheila is ready to accept help, to do the real work of healing, the community she tried to destroy will be here. Not because she deserves it, because that's what Rose would have wanted. Amanda broke down completely, and Jennifer held her sister while Frank stood awkwardly by. A 65-year-old rancher who'd never been good with other people's tears, but understood that sometimes crying was the only honest response to grace. After they left, Frank walked out to the pasture where Ranger grazed. The bull had been restless lately, more alert, watching the property lines with the kind of vigilance that suggested he remembered the surveyors, the threats, the intrusion into his territory. Frank had been thinking about Rose's training methods, about how she'd used classical conditioning to teach Ranger gentle behaviors. What if he applied the same principles differently? Not to make the bull aggressive, but to reinforce his natural protective instincts. He'd been working on it quietly for 2 weeks, ever since the cattle poisoning, playing recordings of vehicle sounds during feeding time, specifically the sound of a Tesla Model X, that distinctive high-pitched hum of electric motors combined with the alarm chirp Sheila's car made. He'd isolated the frequency, 1200 hertz, and played it while rewarding Ranger with grain and molasses treats. Classical conditioning, the same method Pavlov had used with dogs, the same principles Rose had employed to train a bull to respond to her whistle. Now Ranger would orient toward that specific sound from 400 yards away, would begin moving toward it with purpose, not attacking, just investigating, protecting, doing what bulls did when their territory was threatened. Frank didn't know if he'd ever need this training. Sheila was headed toward treatment, not confrontation. The bike path was dead. The conservation easement would be filed within days. But something in him wanted to be prepared, wanted to honor Rose's memory by using her methods to protect what she'd loved. He played the Tesla alarm sound through his phone speaker. Ranger's ears swiveled immediately. The bull lifted his massive head, focused on the sound source, began walking toward Frank with deliberate steps. "Good boy," Frank said, offering a handful of molasses grain. "You're doing good work." The weeks that followed brought a strange peace to the ranch. Sheriff Thompson called to report that Sheila had checked into a psychiatric facility in Austin, had signed voluntary commitment papers, was beginning intensive treatment for trauma and personality disorders. Her daughters visited her twice a week and reported slow progress. The FBI investigation continued, but federal prosecutors were considering a plea deal that would involve restitution, probation, and mandatory ongoing treatment instead of prison. Not because Sheila deserved mercy, but because putting a mentally ill woman in federal prison wouldn't serve justice better than getting her the help she needed. Judge Carolyn filed the conservation easement on the first Monday in June. 1,400 acres of hill country protected permanently, 7 ranching families committed to sustainable practices. Rose's vision finally realized 18 months after her death. Maria Santos published her findings about the hill country salamander, triggering federal protection that would prevent any development in the creek watershed, regardless of property ownership or easement status. Rose's research, updated and expanded, had created an ecological shield that would outlast everyone involved, and the quilting circle finished all the details for the dedication ceremony, scheduled for June 20th, Rose's birthday. They'd invited everyone, posted announcements in newspapers and community centers, created a Facebook event that had gotten 1,200 RSVPs from people who'd known Rose or cared about land conservation, or just wanted to witness something good happening. The new Willow Creek HOA board, led by Bonnie Mitchell, had formally apologized to Frank and offered to partner on the bike path project. A new route, entirely on HOA property, following public roads instead of private land. It would cost more and be less direct, but it would respect property rights and environmental concerns. "This is what Rose would have wanted," Bonnie said when she presented the plans. "Collaboration instead of conflict, community instead of conquest." Frank approved the new path, even offered technical advice about drainage and erosion control. It turned out ranchers knew a lot about moving water and protecting soil. Turned out enemies could become allies when people chose cooperation over domination. June 20th arrived with perfect weather, clear skies, and temperatures in the low 80s, the kind of day made for outdoor celebrations. Frank woke early, put on the suit he'd worn to Rose's funeral, and looked at himself in the mirror. 65 years old, weathered by sun and grief, still setting 2 coffee cups on the counter every morning, still talking to his wife's memory like she might answer, still protecting land she'd loved because protecting it kept her close. Lily arrived at 8, wearing a dress her mother had bought for the occasion and carrying the quilt square she'd made. 12 years old now, changed by the fight they'd survived, more confident, more connected to legacy and land, and the grandmother she barely got to know. "Grandpa, are you nervous?" "About what?" All those people, everyone watching, having to make a speech. Frank hadn't thought about speeches. Judge Carolyn had warned him he'd need to say something, but he'd been avoiding thinking about standing in front of hundreds of people trying to explain what Rose had meant. "I'll figure it out when I get there." They drove to the dedication site together, Frank and Lily and Grace, 3 generations heading toward a celebration of the 4th. The memorial grove had been transformed. White chairs arranged in rows facing a small stage. Tables set up with food the quilting circle had spent days preparing. Rose's memorial quilt hanging from a frame where everyone could see the 80 squares of testimony. And in the center of it all, a bronze marker being installed by workers from the Conservation Trust. Frank walked over to read the inscription being mounted on stone. "The Rose Morrison Memorial Conservation Corridor, established June 20th, 2024, 1,300 acres, protected in perpetuity." She understood. We don't own the land, we belong to it. People started arriving at 9. Ranchers and environmentalists and quilting circle members and HOA residents. Teachers Rose had worked with, and students she'd mentored, and people Frank had never met, but who'd been touched by her work. They filled the chairs and spilled onto the grass, and kept coming until there were close to 1,000 people gathered in the memorial grove. Maria Santos spoke first, explaining the ecological significance of the protected corridor. Judge Carolyn spoke about the legal framework and what it meant for future conservation efforts. Diane talked about Rose's vision and the community she'd built. Then it was Frank's turn. He walked to the microphone on shaking legs, looked at the sea of faces, and forgot everything he'd planned to say. The silence stretched awkward and long, and finally he just told the truth. "Rose Morrison was my wife for 41 years. She died 16 months ago while we were eating breakfast. Coffee cup halfway to her lips, gone before I could catch her. The last thing she said to me was, 'The tomatoes need staking.' That's who she was. Always thinking about what needed doing, what needed protecting, what would matter tomorrow." He looked at the memorial grove, at oak trees she'd loved, at soil that held her ashes. "I didn't understand what she was building when she was alive. Didn't see that documenting species and mapping watersheds and fighting developers was about more than science or law. It was about love. Love for land, for creatures who couldn't defend themselves, for generations that would come after us and need wild places to heal them. This corridor we're dedicating today, Rose did most of the work. I just finished what she started, but standing here, seeing all of you, I realized she built something bigger than protected acreage. She built community. She built a network of people who care about the same things, who'll keep fighting for land and water and creatures that matter." Frank's voice cracked, and he paused to collect himself. "We found a time capsule this month. Rose buried it the year we got married, 1982. She left a message for whoever found it. She said love compounds across time." I didn't understand what she meant then, but I do now. Her love for this land is still here, still working, still protecting. It compounds through Maria's research and Diane's organizing, and Judge Carolyn's legal work and Lily's videos, and 1,000 acts of care by people who never met Rose but believe in what she believed in. He looked at his granddaughter sitting in the front row. "Lily, come here, please." She walked to the stage, confused but trusting. Frank pulled the time capsule from under the podium, opened it, took out his grandfather's pocket watch. "Rose put this in the capsule 43 years ago. My grandfather gave it to me when I took over the ranch. Rose wanted it preserved for someone who'd understand what it represented. Continuity, legacy. the idea that some things matter more than one lifetime. He handed the watch to Lily. "This is yours now. When you're old enough to run this ranch, when you're making decisions about land and water and what needs protecting, remember that you're part of something bigger. You're carrying forward work that started before you were born and will continue after you're gone." That's what this watch means. That's what this corridor means. That's what Rose's life meant. Lily held the watch with both hands, tears streaming down her face, and Frank pulled her into a hug while the crowd rose to their feet in applause that echoed through the oak trees. After the ceremony, after the speeches and the food and the photographs, after most people had left and the sun was starting to descend, Frank found himself alone in the memorial grove with just Diane and Grace. "You did good work today," Grace said. "Rose would be proud. I just told the truth. Sometimes that's enough." They sat on the bench Frank had repaired, the three of them watching shadows lengthen across protected land. And for the first time since Rose died, Frank felt something other than grief. Not happiness exactly, but peace. The sense that he'd honored her memory in ways that mattered, that her work would continue, that love really did compound across time if you let it. His phone buzzed. A text from Bonnie. "You need to know something. Sheila was released from treatment yesterday. Her doctors say she's made progress but needs ongoing support. She asked if she could attend the ceremony today. I told her no, that you'd requested she stay away. But Frank, she's in hill country. I don't know what she's planning." Frank showed the message to Diane and Grace. They exchanged looks that carried 40 years of friendship and unspoken communication. "We should go," Diane said. "Get you home before she does something unpredictable." But Frank looked at the memorial grove, at the bronze marker gleaming in evening light, at the quilt hanging from its frame showing 80 ways Rose had touched lives. This was what they'd fought for. This moment of completion, of legacy secured, of work finished. "Let her come if she wants," Frank said. "We won, the easement is filed, the land is protected. What can she possibly do to change that?" He didn't know that within an hour, Sheila would make a choice that would create the moment this whole fight had been building toward. Didn't know that Ranger's training would matter in ways he hadn't anticipated. Didn't know that sometimes justice requires both law and something older, something more primal, something that involves a 2,400-pound bull and an expensive car and 1,000 witnesses. But he'd find out soon enough. For now, he sat with his mother and his wife's best friend in the place where Rose's ashes were scattered, watching the sunset over land that would outlive them all, and felt something he hadn't felt in 16 months, hope. The sun was settling toward the western hills when Sheila Patterson's white Tesla Model X pulled into the Memorial Grove parking area. Frank saw it from where he sat with Diane and Grace on the bench that overlooked Rose's resting place, saw the distinctive vehicle that had become a symbol of everything this fight had been about. Most of the dedication crowd had dispersed, heading home with full stomachs and lighter hearts, carrying the feeling that sometimes good things still happened in a world that seemed determined to reward cruelty. But about 100 people remained, lingering in small groups, taking photos with the bronze memorial marker, studying the quilt that told Rose's story in 80 squares of fabric and memory. Sheila emerged from the Tesla slowly, like someone who'd forgotten how to move with confidence. She'd lost more weight, Frank noticed. Her expensive athleisure hung loose on a frame that had always been carefully maintained, and her face carried the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting yourself instead of the world. She stood beside her car for a long moment, looking at the celebration she hadn't been invited to, the memorial dedicated to the woman whose work she'd tried to destroy. Then she started walking toward the crowd with hesitant steps. Bonnie Mitchell saw her first, moved to intercept. "Sheila, you shouldn't be here. Frank asked that you stay away." "I know, I'm not here to cause trouble. I just wanted to see it. The thing I tried to stop. The thing Rose built." People were noticing now, conversations stopping, as heads turned toward the woman who'd poisoned cattle and forged documents and become the villain in a story that had consumed hill country for months. The crowd shifted, some people moving away, others moving closer with the curiosity of witnesses who sensed drama approaching. Frank stood, walked toward Sheila before the situation could escalate into something ugly. Grace grabbed his arm. "Son, be careful." "I will, Ma." He approached Sheila the way he'd approach a wounded animal, with caution and compassion in equal measure. Up close, he could see how much the treatment had cost her. Dark circles under eyes that had lost their calculating sharpness, hands that trembled slightly. The posture of someone who'd been broken down to fundamentals and was trying to rebuild from raw materials. Mr. Morrison, her voice was different too, softer, uncertain, stripped of the boardroom authority she'd wielded like a weapon. I'm sorry. I know that word doesn't fix anything, doesn't bring back your cattle or undo the harm I caused, but I needed to say it. Needed you to hear it from me, not from my daughters or my therapist. You weren't supposed to be here. I know. I left the treatment center yesterday. My daughters think I'm at their apartment in Austin, but I couldn't move forward without seeing what I tried to destroy, without understanding what was worth all that fighting. She looked past him at the memorial marker, at the quilt, at the oak trees that had watched over this land for a century. Rose visited me after my daughter died. Did you know that? I found out recently. She brought flowers, sat with me for 3 hours while I cried, told me that guilt would destroy me if I let it, that the only way forward was through forgiveness. Self-forgiveness first, then everything else. Sheila's eyes filled with tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. I couldn't hear her then. Was too angry, too broken. I blamed her for the wetland case, blamed her testimony for starting the investigation that ended my career. In my mind, she was the reason my daughter spiraled, the reason my life fell apart. It was easier to hate her than to face my own choices. Rose would have forgiven you. I know. That makes it worse somehow. She offered me grace, and I tried to erase her legacy. Sheila turned to fully face him. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm just asking you to know that I understand now. What I did was unforgivable, and I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to be better than the person who did those things. Frank looked at this woman who'd been his enemy and saw what Rose must have seen. Not a monster, just a human being who'd made terrible choices from a place of pain and had the courage to admit it. Rose would say every day is a chance to start over. Your wife was a better person than I'll ever be. Maybe, but she believed people could change if they chose to. She believed in second chances. Frank extended his hand. Sheila stared at it like she couldn't quite process the gesture, then took it with both of hers. Her grip was weak, her hands cold despite the June warmth. Thank you for not destroying me completely, for letting my daughters negotiate treatment instead of prison, for finishing Rose's work instead of letting my hate kill it. She released his hand, stepped back, and for a moment, Frank thought she was leaving. Thought this would end with quiet reconciliation, with mercy extended and accepted, with both of them walking away toward healing. That's when they heard the child scream. The sound came from the parking area, high-pitched and terrified. Everyone turned toward it simultaneously, saw a toddler, maybe 3 years old, running between parked cars chasing a ball that was bouncing toward County Road 12. Behind the child, a mother was running, screaming for her son to stop, but the boy was focused only on the ball, on catching it before it rolled into traffic. Sheila was closest. She ran without thinking, faster than Frank would have guessed she could move, reaching the child just as the ball bounced into the road. She grabbed him, pulled him back against her body, the ball disappearing under the wheels of a pickup truck that hadn't even seen the danger. The mother reached them seconds later, sobbing, taking her son from Sheila's arms. Thank you, oh my God, thank you. Sheila stood there breathing hard, adrenaline and relief mixing into something that looked like the first genuine emotion Frank had seen from her in months. He's okay. You're both okay. But in her haste, she'd left her Tesla unlocked, door slightly ajar, and in the silence that followed the near accident, the vehicle's security system activated. The door ajar alert, that distinctive chirp at 1200 hertz, the exact frequency Frank had been training Ranger to respond to for 6 weeks. The sound carried across the memorial grove, across the pasture, across 400 yards of hill country air, to where a 2,400-pound Highland bull was grazing in evening peace. Ranger's massive head lifted. His ears swiveled toward the sound that meant food and reward and attention. His body oriented toward the source with the kind of focused intensity that 43 years of Rose's classical conditioning methodology had created. And then he charged. Frank saw it happening, saw the bull accelerate from standstill to full gallop with the power of an animal that had been bred for strength and trained to respond to exactly this stimulus. He opened his mouth to yell a command, to call the bull back, But Ranger was already committed, already moving through the fence line at the section Frank had deliberately weakened for exactly this purpose. The Highland bull hit the fence and kept going, boards splintering, wire snapping, nothing slowing 2,400 pounds of conditioned response and territorial protection. People in the parking area started screaming, scattering away from the charging animal. The crowd that moments ago had been celebrating conservation, now fleeing from nature's most basic equation, bull plus threat equals violence. Sheila turned at the screams, saw Ranger coming, saw the massive animal bearing down on her Tesla with single-minded purpose. She tried to move toward the car, to close the door and silence the alarm, but Bonnie grabbed her arm. "Don't! Get away from the vehicle!" Ranger covered the last 100 yards in seconds that felt like slow motion to everyone watching. The bull's hooves threw up dirt and grass. His breath came in powerful snorts. His horns caught evening light as he lowered his head and hit the Tesla's front end like a freight train meeting a toy car. The impact was catastrophic and precise. The Tesla's front bumper crumpled, the hood buckled, the windshield spiderwebbed. The alarm cut out immediately, killed by the destruction of its own electrical system. But Ranger wasn't finished. The bull circled the vehicle, hitting it again from the side. The driver's door caved inward, the side mirror exploded, the entire car rocked on its suspension. And somewhere inside, batteries began making the kind of unhealthy sounds that meant expensive engineering was becoming expensive scrap metal. People were filming. Of course they were filming. 100 phones pointed at the scene, capturing every moment of agricultural justice, every second of a bull systematically destroying a $90,000 vehicle, while its owner watched in horrified fascination. Ranger hit the car a third time, denting the rear panel, then stopped. He lifted his massive head, looked around for threats, found none. The alarm was silent. The territory was secured. His work was done. Frank walked toward the destruction, moving slowly so he wouldn't spook the bull, holding out a handful of molasses grain he'd pocketed from the barn before the dedication ceremony. Old habits, always carrying treats for an animal who'd been Rose's most successful training project. "Good boy," Frank said quietly. "You did good work. Now come here." Ranger turned toward Frank's voice, toward the man who'd fed him every day for 16 months, who'd taken over Rose's role as primary caretaker. The bull walked to Frank, lowered his head to accept the grain, and made the low rumbling sound that meant contentment. Frank scratched between Ranger's horns, led him away from the destroyed Tesla, back toward the pasture he'd charged from. The crowd parted silently, giving them wide berth, phones still recording every moment. Sheila stood beside what was left of her car, and slowly, incredibly, she started to laugh. Not hysterical laughter. Not the sound of someone breaking, real laughter, the kind that came from finally seeing the universe's sense of humor. "I deserve that," she said to no one in particular. "I absolutely deserve that." Frank returned from settling Ranger in the barn to find Sheila still standing beside her destroyed Tesla, now surrounded by people offering sympathy or satisfaction, or simple curiosity. He pushed through the crowd, pulled the manila envelope he'd been carrying in his jacket pocket since the ceremony began. "Mrs. Patterson." She turned toward him, mascara smeared from laughing or crying or both, her expression somewhere between devastation and liberation. Frank handed her the envelope. "This is the final legal settlement. Civil damages for the cattle poisoning, trespassing, and harassment. Your daughters negotiated the amount with Judge Carolyn. You have 5 years to pay in installments." Sheila took the envelope with shaking hands. "How much?" $35,000, plus you're banned from any contact with my property or family, forever." She nodded, accepting the terms without argument. "That's fair, more than fair." Frank looked at the destroyed Tesla, at the phone still filming, at the crowd waiting to see what would happen next. He thought about Rose, about how she'd shown mercy to this woman when she was drowning in grief, about how some lessons required expensive tuition. He spoke loud enough for everyone to hear, loud enough for the phones to record, for the videos that would go viral by morning to capture. "Progress waits for no bull, Mrs. Patterson." The crowd erupted. Laughter and applause, and the kind of delighted recognition that came from hearing someone's own words turned back on them with perfect timing. Sheila looked at Frank, looked at her destroyed car, looked at the memorial marker celebrating the woman she'd tried to erase, and nodded. "She'd be proud of you, Rose, for finishing her work, for showing mercy when I deserved destruction. Tell your granddaughter I'm sorry. Tell her I hope she protects this land better than I protected my own integrity." Sheila pulled out her phone, called for a tow truck, and sat on the grass to wait. She didn't look destroyed. She looked lighter somehow, like having the worst thing happen. Having her expensive symbol of progress reduced to scrap by a bull she'd effectively trained through her own harassment, had freed her from having to fear consequences. Over the next hour, the crowd dispersed for real this time, carrying videos and stories that would make this day legendary. Frank watched them go, watched the sun complete its descent, watched stars begin appearing in a sky that Rose used to photograph. Diane approached with Lily, both of them looking slightly stunned by what they'd witnessed. "That was the most perfect thing I've ever seen," Diane said. "Rose would have loved it." Rose would have felt bad for Sheila. Maybe, but she also would have appreciated poetic justice. Lily held up her phone. "Grandpa, I posted the video. It already has 50,000 views. By morning, it would have 5 million. By the end of the week, 20 million. The story of a Highland bull destroying an HOA president's Tesla after she'd tried to steal a rancher's land would become the kind of viral moment that defined internet culture, that showed up in news articles and late-night comedy shows, and motivated thousands of people to support land conservation. But Frank didn't know that yet. He just stood in the memorial grove with his granddaughter and his wife's best friend, looking at land that was finally permanently protected. 3 months later, autumn painted hill country in shades of gold and rust. Frank stood in the south pasture at the grave where 6 cattle were buried under earth that now bloomed with wildflowers exactly as Lily had planned. The Indian paintbrush and bluebonnets had given way to fall asters and goldenrod, and the small marker they'd placed showed names that mattered: Magnolia, Buttercup, Daisy, Clementine, Poppy, Violet. Rose's cattle remembered. Ranger grazed nearby, older now, slower, but still the undisputed king of his territory. The bull had become a celebrity, featured in agriculture magazines and conservation publications. His image used to promote heritage livestock breeding. People wanted Ranger's offspring, wanted bulls trained with Rose's methods, wanted to believe that gentleness and strength could coexist. Frank's phone buzzed, a text from Bonnie. "Thought you'd want to know?" Sheila completed her plea deal. Probation, restitution, mandatory therapy. She's teaching environmental law to inmates at the county jail, using Rose's research as curriculum. Frank smiled. Redemption took strange forms sometimes. Sheila Patterson would spend years trying to rebuild what she'd destroyed, would never fully succeed, but would do real good in the attempt. That was enough. Another text, this one from Maria Santos. "The field station is open. First class of grad students arrived yesterday. 6 of them, all studying watershed conservation. They're using Rose's original journals as primary texts." The Rose Morrison Field Station had become reality, a partnership between 3 universities and the Conservation Trust. Students would spend semesters learning from the land Rose had studied, continuing research she'd started, adding to knowledge she'd begun accumulating 40 years ago. Frank drove to the field station that afternoon, a converted barn on the northern section of his property. Inside, young people hunched over microscopes and laptops, examining samples and data, doing the work Rose had loved. One of them, a young woman named Sarah, approached him. "Mr. Morrison, I'm studying the salamander population your wife documented. Her field notes are incredible. The detail, the consistency, the love that comes through every observation. She was a remarkable scientist. She was a remarkable person. We're planning to name the species subspecies after her, Eurysea hillcountriensis morrisoni. It has to go through formal approval, but the committee is supportive. Your wife's contribution to conservation biology deserves recognition." Frank felt his throat tighten. Rose's name would be attached to a species, would appear in scientific papers and textbooks, would be spoken by people who never knew her but benefited from her work. She'd be honored, and probably embarrassed. Why embarrassed? Rose didn't do the work for recognition. She did it because the work mattered. He left the students to their research, drove back to the house where 2 coffee cups still waited on the counter every morning. Some habits would never change, some losses would never fully heal. But Frank was learning to live with absence, to let grief become something other than pain. That evening, Lily arrived for her weekend visit, but she wasn't alone. She'd brought 3 friends from school, girls her age who'd seen the viral video and wanted to meet the grandfather who'd trained a bull to destroy a Tesla. "Can we see Ranger?" one of them asked, starstruck and nervous. Frank took them to the pasture, showed them how to approach the bull, how to offer grain with flat palms, how to scratch the spot between his horns that made him close his eyes in contentment. The girls were frightened at first, then amazed, then completely in love with an animal who weighed more than all four of them combined, but was gentle as a dog when treated with respect. "Your grandma trained him?" one girl asked. "She saved him first, found him nearly frozen as a calf, brought him into her kitchen, bottle-fed him for a week. Then she trained him using kindness and consistency, showed him that humans could be trusted." "And you trained him to smash cars?" Frank smiled. "I trained him to protect his home. The car was just unfortunate timing." They spent the evening on the porch, Frank telling stories about Rose to an audience that actually wanted to listen, about how she'd started with 19 species and ended with 47, about her fight to protect wetlands from developers, about her belief that land conservation wasn't about stopping progress, but about defining what progress actually meant. The girls posted photos on Instagram and TikTok, Lily showing off her heritage and the currency her generation understood. Frank didn't mind. If social media could make conservation cool to 13-year-olds, Rose would have been all for it. December brought the first hard freeze, and with it, news that Grace was failing. 80 years old, a lifetime of ranching and raising children and fighting for what mattered. Her body was finally admitting defeat. Frank moved her from the cottage into the main house, set up a hospital bed in the living room where she could look out at land she'd called home for 8 decades. Hospice nurses came twice daily, but mostly it was Frank and Lily, taking shifts, keeping her comfortable, listening to stories from a life that had witnessed depression and war, and the slow transformation of Texas from frontier to something else. "I'm ready," Grace said one evening, her voice weak but clear. "Lived a good life, raised good kids, saw you finish Rose's work. That's enough." "Don't talk like that, Ma." "Why not? Death's not tragic when you've had enough time. I've had plenty, more than most." She reached for his hand with fingers that had grown thin and fragile. "Promise me you'll teach Lily everything. About the land, about cattle, about why this work matters. She's the future, Frank. Make sure she understands what she's inheriting." "I promise." "And promise me you'll finish grieving Rose. Not forget her. Never forget her. But let yourself be happy again. She wouldn't want you frozen in that morning she died." Frank couldn't promise that, so he just held his mother's hand and let her fall asleep, still grasping his fingers. Grace Morrison died 3 days before Christmas, peacefully in her sleep, having lived long enough to see her son finish his wife's work and her great-granddaughter commit to carrying it forward. They buried her beside Frank's father in the family plot, under oak trees that had watched over Morrison's for 100 years. At the funeral, Lily stood beside Frank and held his hand through the service. Afterward, she turned to him with eyes that looked older than 13. "Grandpa, I've decided I'm studying conservation biology, going to UT Austin like Grandma Rose, going to run the field station someday." Frank pulled her close. This child who'd lost her grandmother and great-grandmother in less than 2 years, but still chose to carry forward instead of retreating. "Rose would be so proud." "I know, that's why I have to do it." Spring returned like it always did, indifferent to human grief, but bringing renewal anyway. Frank was 72 years old now, 7 years after Rose's death, working the ranch at a pace that acknowledged his aging body. Lily was 19, finishing her freshman year at UT, spending weekends at the field station, following the path Rose had carved through sheer determination. The girl who'd once thought ranching was boring had become the field station's most dedicated student, had published her first research paper about salamander habitat at 18, was building a life around protecting what her grandmother had loved. The conservation corridor thrived. 7 ranching families working together, sustainable practices keeping the land healthy, wildlife populations stabilizing. The bike path Bonnie's HOA had built on public property got more use than Sheila's version ever would have, proof that cooperation worked better than conquest. And Sheila Patterson, 61 years old now, taught environmental law to incarcerated women twice a week, using Rose's field journals as textbooks. Her daughters visited regularly, relationships slowly mending through the hard work of therapy and genuine change. She'd never fully repair the damage she'd caused, but she was trying, and trying counted for something. Frank had forgiven her. not because she deserved it, but because carrying hate was exhausting, and Rose would have wanted mercy. They'd never be friends, would never share coffee or conversation, but they'd achieved something rarer than friendship. They'd found mutual peace. On a June morning, 7 years after the dedication ceremony, Frank walked to the memorial grove where Rose's ashes had become part of soil that fed oak trees. The bench had weathered 7 more years of Texas sun and rain, but still held his weight. He didn't talk to Rose as much anymore. Didn't need to. She was present in other ways now. In Lily's research, in the field station, in protected land that would outlast everyone who'd fought for it, in a species that bore her name, in the videos that still circulated of a Highland bull defending her legacy. His phone buzzed. Lily's number. "Grandpa, I got accepted to the PhD program, full scholarship. They want me to study climate impacts on hill country ecosystems." Pride flooded through him, so strong it felt physical. "That's wonderful, honey. Rose would be over the moon." "I know, I can feel her sometimes. When I'm doing field work, like she's watching, making sure I'm getting the data right." She probably is. After the call, Frank sat on the bench and watched morning light paint the hills. 72 years old, third-generation rancher, widower, grandfather to a scientist who would carry forward work that mattered. He thought about the time capsule Rose had buried in 1982, about her message that love compounded across time. She'd been right. Her love for this land had multiplied through the people she'd taught, the community she'd built, the vision she'd protected through determination and grace. Ranger was gone now, had died at 14 of old age, peacefully in his pasture. But 47 of his calves carried his genetics forward, Highland cattle raised with Rose's methods spreading across 6 states. The bull who'd become famous for destroying a Tesla had left a legacy of gentleness and strength, proof that protection and kindness weren't contradictory. Frank's phone buzzed again. A video someone had forwarded, the Tesla destruction footage that still made rounds 7 years later. 28 million views now, comments in dozens of languages, people across the world celebrating a moment of perfect justice. He watched it one more time, saw Ranger charge, saw the Tesla crumple, saw himself hand Sheila the legal settlement and deliver the line that had become a meme. "Progress waits for no bull." It was good television, but the real story was quieter, less viral, more important. The real story was in protected land and continuing research, and a 19-year-old choosing to dedicate her life to work that didn't pay well but mattered deeply. That evening, Frank stood at the fence where Ranger used to graze and watched the sun set over 1,400 acres of conservation corridor. The land looked the same as it had when his grandfather homesteaded here in 1889. Same hills, same grass, same creek, flowing clean through soil that fed generations. But it was different too. Protected now, studied, understood, valued not just for what it could produce, but for what it was. Rose had done that, had transformed working ranch land into something science could protect and communities could celebrate. Frank pulled out his phone, opened the Notes app, began typing. Not for anyone else, just for himself. A record of what mattered. 7 years after Rose died. Lily accepted to PhD program. Conservation corridor thriving. 28 million people watched a bull defend her legacy. Not bad for a scientist who thought nobody was paying attention. He paused, then added one more line. "The land remembers, Rosie, so do I." That night, for the first time in 7 years, Frank didn't set out 2 coffee cups. He set out one. Not because he'd forgotten Rose or loved her less, but because he'd finally learned what she'd tried to teach him all along. Love didn't require physical presence to be real. It didn't need coffee cups or daily rituals or endless grief. It just needed to be honored through action, protected through work, passed forward through teaching. He'd done that. They'd all done that. The quilting circle and the ranchers and Judge Carolyn and Maria Santos and even Sheila in her broken attempt at redemption. Together, they'd proven that one person's vision could survive their death if enough people chose to carry it forward. Frank slept better that night than he had in 7 years. Dreamed of Rose in her garden, young and vital and laughing. In the dream, she turned to him and smiled. "You finished it, Frank. The easement, the research, the teaching. You made sure the work continued." "We finished it, all of us. That's what I tried to tell you. Nothing worthwhile is ever accomplished alone. It takes community. It takes people willing to fight for something bigger than themselves. I miss you. I know, but look what you built from that missing. Look at Lily. Look at the corridor. Look at 7 years of protection because you refused to quit. Was it worth it, all the fighting? Rose's smile widened. What do you think? Frank woke to birdsong and sunrise, to land that would outlive him, to work that would continue after he was gone. He made coffee, poured one cup, carried it to the porch where 7 years ago he'd sat with Diane and Grace, planning how to fight an enemy who seemed unbeatable. They'd beaten her. Not through destruction, but through persistence, through community organizing and legal strategy, and a 12-year-old's viral videos and a bull who'd been trained to protect his home. But more importantly, they'd built something that would outlast the fight: protected land, continuing research, and a new generation committed to carrying forward work that mattered. That was Rose's real legacy. Not the science, not the species named after her, not even the conservation corridor. Her legacy was people who chose to care about things that wouldn't benefit them personally, who fought for future generations they'd never meet, who understood that land didn't belong to anyone, but everyone belonged to the land. Frank sipped his coffee and watched morning light reveal the hills, and for the first time since Rose died, he felt complete peace. Not happiness, not the absence of grief, but the deep satisfaction of knowing he'd honored her memory in the only way that truly mattered. By finishing the work, by protecting what she'd loved, by making sure her vision outlived them both. The land remembered. It remembered Rose's 40 years of research. It remembered her garden and her cattle and her unwavering belief that this place was worth protecting. It remembered through the salamanders in the creek and the birds in the oak trees and the soil that grew richer every season. And Frank remembered too. Would remember until his own time came, until he joined Rose and Grace and all the Morrisons who'd worked this land before him. Would remember that some things mattered more than convenience or profit or progress measured in concrete. Would remember that love, real love, didn't end with death. It just changed forms, became work and protection, and the choice to carry forward what mattered. The coffee was good, the sunrise was beautiful, the land was safe. Rose would have been proud. And that, Frank thought, was enough.